It began beside a river that refused to care who crossed it. Stavelot rested along the banks of the Amblève, a quiet town shaped by water, stone, and centuries of slow movement. Its bridges were modest, its streets narrow. Its abbey stood as it always had, watching life pass rather than shaping it. In winter, the river moved dark and cold beneath gray skies, and the town felt withdrawn from the larger world. But in December of 1944, Stavelot became a hinge in a battle that depended entirely on speed, and water would decide how fast steel could move. The German Ardennes Offensive had surged forward with violence and surprise, punching westward through forests and thin lines that had not expected an attack of such scale. Armor rolled through snow-covered roads, infantry followed close behind, and for a brief moment, momentum felt real. But momentum is fragile. It depends on bridges staying intact, roads remaining open, and fuel continuing to flow. Stavelot stood directly in the path of that momentum. The bridges over the Amblève were vital. Without them, German armor could not continue west at the pace the offensive demanded. Detours would cost hours. Hours would cost fuel. Fuel would cost the war. Taking Stavelot quickly was not optional. It was essential. When German forces reached the outskirts of the town, they did so with urgency sharpened by narrowing margins. Tanks pressed forward along roads that funneled directly toward the river. Infantry moved through surrounding ground, trying to secure approaches before resistance could harden. Orders emphasized speed over caution. The river had to be crossed, but the Allies were already reacting. American units rushed to defend the town and its bridges, knowing exactly what failure would mean. Defensive positions were improvised in streets, behind stone walls, inside buildings never meant to stop tanks. Engineers prepared demolition charges. Infantry spread out along riverbanks and approaches, watching every movement with growing tension. The first fighting came quickly. Gunfire cracked through the town as German units pushed in, moving aggressively, trying to overwhelm resistance before bridges could be destroyed. Tanks fired down streets barely wide enough to contain them. Shells slammed into buildings, collapsing walls into rubble that clogged the very roads the attackers needed to use. Smoke filled the air, mixing with winter fog until direction and distance became uncertain. Stavelot became chaos compressed into tight space. The Amblève ran through the center of it all, cold, fast, unforgiving. German units fought desperately to secure crossings intact. American defenders fought just as desperately to deny them. Each bridge became a focal point, drawing fire from both sides. Engineers worked under fire. Infantry clashed at close range. Tanks burned beside water that hissed and steamed as debris fell into it. Time mattered more than ground. Every minute. The bridges held denied momentum. Every explosion forced rerouting. Every stalled vehicle tightened the choke point. German forces did manage to cross parts of Stavelot, but not cleanly, not quickly, and not without cost. Vehicles crowded narrow streets. Supply columns stacked up behind the lead elements. Fuel trucks waited where aircraft and artillery could find them. The town became a bottleneck that turned speed into vulnerability. Then the pressure shifted. American counterattacks struck from multiple directions, forcing German units to fight for ground they had barely taken. Artillery fire began to bracket roads and bridge approaches. Allied aircraft, once weather allowed, targeted movement relentlessly. What had been an advance through Stavelot became a struggle to hold and escape it. The river that had promised passage became a barrier again. As fighting raged, civilians hid in basements and cellars as shells shook stone walls overhead. Fires spread. The abbey stood, damaged but unbroken, watching another chapter of violence unfold without consent. Snow fell again, settling on wreckage and bodies alike, indifferent to purpose or uniform. Eventually, the German position in and around Stavelot became untenable. Fuel shortages worsened. Supply lines fractured. Routes east became threatened. The same bridges that had been so desperately sought now became liabilities, points of exposure rather than escape. Under increasing pressure, German units withdrew, leaving behind destroyed vehicles, burned buildings, and a town torn apart by the weight of momentum it could not sustain. Stavelot held, and because it held, something larger began to fail. The delay at the river disrupted the German timetable at a critical moment. Fuel failed to reach forward units when it mattered most. Armor that should have raced west slowed, then stalled. The Ardennes Offensive did not collapse at Stavelot alone, but Stavelot helped drain the speed it could never recover. The Battle of Stavelot matters because it shows how modern war can hinge on ordinary places. A river, a bridge, a town that never asked to matter. It reminds us that momentum is not unstoppable. It can be drowned in narrow streets, broken bridges, and stubborn defense applied at exactly the wrong place for an attacker. Tonight, we return to that river crossing. To the streets where speed turned into congestion. To the bridges where minutes outweighed miles. To Stavelot, where water slowed steel and helped bend a battle back on itself. Before we go any further, I want to invite you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time has found you there? Is it late and quiet, or is the day just beginning to loosen its grip? If listening to these slow, detailed journeys through overlooked battle lines helps you feel grounded, focused, or simply less rushed in a noisy world, consider subscribing, not for dramatic endings, but for the steady presence of stories that unfold at the pace history truly moved. Settle in. This is the Battle of Stavelot, where a river quietly reshaped a winter offensive. December 17th, 1944. 3:15 in the afternoon. A column of American prisoners stumbles westward along a frozen Belgian road, their boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. They're survivors of something that shouldn't exist. A massive German offensive that erupted from the Ardennes forest just 30 hours earlier, shattering what everyone believed was a quiet sector where green American divisions went to rest and battered ones went to recover. The men are from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, and they carry with them a warning that will reach the small town of Stavelot within hours. Tiger tanks are coming, hundreds of them, moving faster than anything the Wehrmacht has managed in 4 years of retreat. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas has just been reborn in the worst way imaginable, and the ghost column approaching through the fog is about to make Stavelot the most important intersection in Western Europe. The Ardennes Offensive, what will later be called the Battle of the Bulge, caught American forces so completely off guard that some units were overrun while eating breakfast. At 5:30 in the morning, on December 16th, 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 85-mile front, their shells landing on foxholes occupied by soldiers who'd been told that this sector was safe. Within hours, entire American regiments were disintegrating, pulling back in confusion or surrendering in clusters. The forest itself seemed to be attacking, Tiger tanks and Panther tanks and columns of SS infantry materializing from tree lines where reconnaissance had reported nothing but snow and silence. By the afternoon of December 17th, the German penetration had reached 25 kilometers. In some sectors, with spearheads racing westward toward bridges that hadn't been wired for demolition because nobody thought they'd ever need defending. The Allied High Command, still focused on plans to cross the Rhine River and drive into Germany's heartland, was scrambling to understand what was happening. The ghost column approaching Stavelot was the leading edge of the most dangerous German offensive since 1940. Stavelot itself was a town of about 7,000 people, clustered along the banks of the Amblève River, in a steep valley where stone houses climbed hillsides and a single bridge connected the north-south road that had carried trade and armies for centuries. In peacetime, it was known for its abbey and its tanners and the waterfalls just upstream that gave the river its name, the Amblève, meaning white water. In December of 1944, Stavelot was known for exactly one thing to the American military. It sat on the road junction where Highway N23 crossed the Amblève, and whoever controlled that junction controlled access to the flat tank country beyond. The bridge was stone, 60 meters long and 8 meters wide, built to carry farm wagons and Belgian automobiles. Nobody had designed it to matter in a world war. Yet here it was, about to become the most fought over 50 meters on the Western Front, simply because a German planner had drawn a red line through Stavelot on a map and labeled it Rollbahn D, Roadway D, the route assigned to the spearhead that was supposed to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours. The American defenders in Stavelot that evening consisted primarily of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, and specifically Company C of that battalion, about 500 men whose job description included building bridges, clearing mines, and repairing roads. They were construction workers in uniform, trained to operate bulldozers and lay pontoon bridges and set demolition charges, to clear obstacles, not to fight tanks in street-to-street combat. Their commanding officer, Major Paul Solis, was a competent engineer who'd spent the past 6 months building bridges across French rivers and hadn't fired his weapon in anger since landing in Normandy. When he received orders on the evening of December 17th to hold Stavelot at all costs, he looked at his roster and saw carpenters, surveyors, demolition experts, and truck drivers. He looked at his weapons inventory and saw 3 bazookas with limited ammunition, some 30 caliber machine guns, M1 Garand rifles, and no anti-tank guns whatsoever. The defense plan he sketched on a hand-drawn map that night was less a tactical scheme than a prayer. Spread his 500 men around a 2-kilometer perimeter, put the best rifle shots in buildings overlooking the highway, position the bazookas where they might get side shots at tank armor, and hope that whatever was coming would arrive slowly enough for reinforcements to reach them first. Belgian civilians in Stavelot knew something terrible was approaching before the American soldiers did. Father Hanlet, the parish priest, had been hiding refugees in the church cellar since the morning of December 16th. Families from villages to the east who'd fled with stories of SS troops burning houses and executing mayors. By the evening of December 17th, the trickle of refugees had become a flood, and the stories had become more specific and more terrifying. A baker from Ligneuville, 8 kilometers east, described Tiger tanks crushing American jeeps like tin cans. A school teacher from Trois Ponts told Father Hanlet that she'd seen American soldiers machine-gunned after surrendering, their bodies left frozen in a field. The civilians whispered a name that meant nothing, yet but would soon mean everything. Piper, the tanker, the one who doesn't stop. Father Hanlet descended into the church cellar that night and found himself responsible for 73 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, sheltering beneath stone vaults built in the 12th century. He tried to reassure them. He told them the Americans would hold. He told them the Germans wouldn't harm civilians. He told them what he needed to tell them. But when he climbed back to the church sanctuary and looked east through the small windows, he could see distant flashes on the horizon and hear the low rumble of engines that seemed to make the ground itself vibrate. The American soldiers setting up defensive positions that night were working with incomplete information and no illusions about their chances. Sergeant Charles Hensel, a demolition specialist with the 291st Engineers, spent the evening of December 17th trying to figure out how 3 bazookas could stop what the refugees were describing as 50 or 60 tanks. He positioned 1 bazooka team in a stone house overlooking the main highway with instructions to aim for tank treads or engine compartments, the only parts of a Tiger or Panther that a bazooka round might penetrate. He positioned a second team near the bridge itself, hoping they'd get a shot at tanks as they slowed to cross the narrow span. The third bazooka he kept as a mobile reserve, which was a fancy way of saying he had no idea where to put it because 3 bazookas couldn't defend 2 kilometers of perimeter against a panzer column. Hensel had been in combat since Normandy, and he'd learned that engineer units survived by being clever and lucky in roughly equal measure. That night, staring at the 3 bazookas that represented his entire anti-tank capability, he didn't feel particularly clever, and he suspected their luck was about to run out. Private Bernard Goldstein spent the night of December 17th building roadblocks, and the absurdity of his situation wasn't lost on him. He was a surveyor by training. His job in the 291st was to measure distances and angles so that bridges could be built to specification. Now he was dragging Belgian furniture into the middle of Highway N23 and piling it alongside abandoned American trucks and felled trees, constructing obstacles that were supposed to slow tanks designed to crush concrete bunkers. The roadblock he and 5 other engineers completed around 10 o'clock that night was impressive in its way, a barrier 3 meters high stretching across both lanes of the highway, incorporating an entire cafe's worth of tables and chairs. They'd even added barbed wire scavenged from a nearby field. Goldstein stood back and looked at their work and thought about the physics of a 50-ton tank encountering a pile of furniture. The math wasn't encouraging, but orders were orders, and doing something felt better than waiting in a foxhole for the inevitable. As he walked back toward his assigned position, Goldstein passed Lieutenant Arch Taylor, who was studying the bridge with a yaur, flashlight, examining the stone abutments, and measuring distances with a tape measure. Taylor was calculating how much explosive it would take to drop the bridge if the order came. Nobody wanted to blow the bridge. It was the only crossing for kilometers, and the Americans might need it themselves. But Taylor wanted to be ready, just in case. The psychology of defensive warfare has a particular quality when the defenders know they're outnumbered and outgunned. Time collapses into a series of moments between now and contact. The soldiers of the 291st spent that night in what veterans later described as counting time, counting the hours until dawn, counting the ammunition in their rifles, counting the probable seconds they'd have between seeing a tank and dying. First Sergeant William Krickenberger moved through the defensive positions around midnight, checking on his men and discovering that most of them weren't sleeping despite being exhausted. They were listening. In the absolute silence of a December night in the Ardennes, sound carried with crystalline clarity, and what the soldiers heard from the east wasn't reassuring. The grinding of tank treads on frozen roads, the distinctive high-pitched whine of German engines, the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under a vehicle's weight. The sounds were getting closer, but it was impossible to judge distances in the dark and the fog. Krickenberger found himself thinking about something his instructor at engineer school had said. Buildings and bridges are predictable because they follow the laws of physics, but combat follows no laws except chaos. Tonight would be chaos. Major Solis spent the hours before midnight in what passed for the battalion command post, a stone house with a radio, a field telephone, and a map that was already obsolete because the front line it showed no longer existed. He'd sent runners to every defensive position with instructions to hold fire until German forces were within 100 meters, to conserve ammunition, and to fall back to secondary positions if the initial line broke. The instructions were clear and professional and completely inadequate to the situation, and Solis knew it. He was an engineer commanding engineers in an infantry fight against an SS panzer column, and the best he could offer his men was clarity about what was expected even if it was impossible. Around 11:30, the field telephone rang with a report from an outpost on the eastern edge of town. Vehicle sounds approximately 1 kilometer away, multiple engines, moving slowly. Solis acknowledged the report and put down the phone and walked outside to look east. The fog was so thick he couldn't see beyond 30 meters. Somewhere in that fog was a column of German armor about to test whether 500 construction workers could hold a bridge against the Wehrmacht's elite. The answer should have been obvious. But wars aren't decided by what should happen, Father. Hanlett heard the first tank arrive at 11:45 on the night of December 17th, and the sound was like nothing he'd ever experienced. Not the rumble of a truck or the clatter of a tractor, but a deep mechanical grinding that seemed to compress the air itself. He was in the church sanctuary, having just finished checking on the refugees in the cellar below. The sound froze him in place for a moment, and then he moved to the window and pulled back the blackout curtain, just enough to see. Through the fog and darkness, he glimpsed a shape moving down the hill toward the bridge, something enormous and angular, its metal hull reflecting the faint starlight. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank stopped about 400 meters from the bridge, its engine idling. Then the night exploded with the sound of a machine gun firing, and Father Hanlett saw tracer rounds arcing through the darkness like red shooting stars, bouncing off the tank's armor in showers of sparks. The Battle for Stavelot had begun, and it would be decided not by armies but by moments. Small decisions and random chances and tiny failures that would cascade into consequences nobody could predict. The Ghost column had arrived. Now it would discover whether ghosts could be stopped by men who built bridges instead of burning them. December 15th, 1944, 2 days before Stavelot. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood in a farmhouse outside Blankenheim, Germany, studying a map spread across a table and listening to his superior officer explain how the war would be won. Peiper was 29 years old, the youngest regimental commander in the Waffen-SS, and he commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of 5,000 men and 600 vehicles built around the 1st SS Panzer Regiment. The officer briefing him was Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th Panzer Army, and Dietrich's instructions were simple to the point of brutality. Drive west to the Meuse River, don't stop for anything, reach the bridges in 48 hours, and cross before the Americans can destroy them. Speed was everything. Hesitation was betrayal. Any obstacle that couldn't be crushed would be bypassed, and any resistance would be eliminated with maximum force. Peiper listened and asked questions about roads and bridges and fuel supplies. And when Dietrich finished, Peiper saluted and walked out into the December cold. He knew exactly what he'd been asked to do. He'd done it before. Joachim Peiper's reputation preceded him like smoke before fire, and by December of 1944, that reputation included chapters written in blood across 3 years of war. In the summer of 1943, Piper's unit had been fighting partisans in northern Italy, where conventional warfare dissolved into a vicious cycle of ambush and reprisal. In the village of Boves, after 2 German soldiers were killed by partisans, Piper ordered the execution of 34 civilians and the burning of the entire village, 300 houses reduced to ash and rubble. The massacre was documented, photographed, and filed away in Italian records that would later resurface at war crimes tribunals. In Russia, Piper's unit had been part of the brutal campaigns of 1941 and 1942, where the rules of warfare were suspended entirely and villages disappeared from maps. Soldiers who served under Piper described him as fearless to the point of recklessness, brilliant in the tactical employment of armor, and utterly indifferent to casualties, both enemy and friendly. He led from the front, often riding in the lead tank of his columns, and his men followed him partly from loyalty and partly from the certain knowledge that hesitation in Piper's presence was more dangerous than enemy fire. The force Piper commanded in December of 1944 was built for speed and shock. 100 tanks and assault guns, including 25 Panther tanks, 6 of the massive King Tiger tanks mounting 88mm guns, and supporting elements of mechanized infantry, engineers, and anti-aircraft guns. The Kampfgruppe stretched 25 kilometers when moving in column formation, a steel serpent winding through Belgian forests and villages, grinding forward on tracks that tore up roads and crushed anything too slow to move aside. Piper's plan, derived from Dietrich's orders, was to follow Rollbahn D, a designated route through Stavelot, Trois Ponts, and Verbemont to the Meuse crossing at Huy. If everything went according to plan, his tanks would cover 90 kilometers in 2 days, a pace that would have been impossible in 1940, but was now achievable because German intelligence insisted the route was lightly defended and because Piper himself had promised it would work. He'd studied the roads, memorized the maps, and calculated fuel consumption down to the last liter. The only variable he couldn't control was American reaction time, and he was betting everything on the chaos and confusion of the offensive's first hours. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. Piper's column lurched forward as 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire across the Ardennes front. The bombardment was supposed to last 30 minutes, but fog and poor communications extended it to 90 minutes in some sectors, which meant Piper spent the first crucial hours of the offensive sitting in his command half-track, listening to shells whistle overhead, while his tanks idled and burned precious fuel. When the advance finally began, Piper immediately encountered his first obstacle, roads clogged with German infantry units that were supposed to have cleared the route, but had instead stalled against unexpected American resistance. Piper radioed for permission to bypass the infantry and was told no. His tanks were needed to break through defensive positions. For 4 hours, Piper's armor ground forward at walking pace, smashing through American positions at Losheim and Lanzerath, while Piper himself stood in his half-track, shouting orders and visibly furious at the delay. By afternoon, the route ahead opened, and Piper's column finally achieved the speed he'd promised. 20, 30, sometimes 40 kilometers per hour on the few straight stretches of road where the fog lifted enough to navigate. But speed came with a cost that Piper either didn't recognize or didn't care about, a trail of burning vehicles and murdered prisoners that would follow his column like a shadow. At Hansfeld, Piper's tanks overran an American supply depot and captured 50 vehicles, including several fuel trucks, a critical resupply that solved his immediate fuel crisis. They also captured dozens of American soldiers, who were lined up against a wall and kept under guard while Piper decided what to do with them. Some were pressed into service unloading fuel. Others were loaded onto trucks to be transported to rear areas. Several were shot attempting to escape, though later testimony would dispute whether they were actually trying to escape or were shot while surrendering. Piper moved on, driving toward Bullingen, where another fuel depot waited. The pattern would repeat throughout December 17th. Advance, capture, shoot if convenient, advance again. Piper's column was moving faster than any German unit had moved since the invasion of France, but it was leaving behind evidence of war crimes that would eventually lead to a courtroom in Dachau. Baugnez Crossroads, Belgium. December 17th, 1944. 11 o'clock in the morning. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was heading south towards St. Vith when it encountered Piper's lead tanks. The Americans, artillerymen, not infantry, were riding in unarmored trucks and jeeps, and they had no chance of fighting tanks. They surrendered immediately, climbing out of their vehicles with hands raised, expecting to be disarmed and marched to a prisoner collection point. Instead, they were herded into a field adjacent to the Crossroads, where approximately 120 men stood in loose formation, wondering what would happen next. German tank crews watched from their turrets. SS infantry stood at the field's edges. Then, without warning or apparent provocation, machine guns opened fire. Men fell in waves, some hit immediately, others throwing themselves to the ground and pretending to be dead. The firing continued for several minutes, methodical, systematic bursts that swept across the field. Then it stopped, and German soldiers walked among the bodies, firing pistol shots into anyone who moved. 84 American soldiers died in that field. 43 survived by playing dead or crawling away after the Germans left. The Malmedy massacre, named for the nearby town though it actually occurred at, Bognaise, would become the most documented German war crime on the Western Front, investigated by military tribunals and used as evidence in post-war trials. But on December 17, 1944, it was just one of several massacres committed by Kampfgruppe Piper during the offensive's first 48 hours. At Ligneuville, 8 American soldiers were shot after surrendering. At Stavelot itself, multiple Belgian civilians would be executed on suspicion of aiding Americans. The pattern suggests not random violence born of combat stress, but a systematic approach to eliminating resistance and witnesses. Whether Piper directly ordered the Malmedy killings remains disputed. He claimed at his trial that he was not present and had given no such orders. But he was the Kampfgruppe commander, he set the tone, and his previous record in Italy and Russia established that civilian and prisoner killings under his command were features rather than accidents. By the evening of December 17th, Piper's column had covered 50 kilometers in 36 hours, an impressive pace, but behind schedule, partly because of the morning delays and partly because resistance was stiffening. At Ligneuville, just 8 kilometers from Stavelot, Piper's lead tanks encountered American troops who fought back before withdrawing, costing him another hour. Piper stood in the village square studying his map by flashlight while his tanks refueled from captured American jerry cans. The next objective was obvious: Stavelot and its bridge over the Amblève. Intelligence reports, such as they were, suggested minimal American presence. The bridge was reportedly intact. Once across the Amblève, the terrain opened up into rolling hills, perfect for tank operations. Piper's operations officer estimated they could reach the Meuse River by midday on December 19th, if they maintained their current pace. But that required crossing the Stavelot Bridge, which meant arriving before the Americans could organize a defense or destroy the span. Piper's personality emerges from later testimony and contemporary records as a study in contradictions, a highly educated man who quoted Goethe and collected books, yet ordered villages burned and prisoners shot. A tactical genius capable of exploiting opportunities with lightning speed, yet prone to fits of rage when subordinates disappointed him. A commander who inspired fierce loyalty from his men, yet accepted their deaths with apparent indifference as the price of speed. In the weeks after Stavelot, as his Kampfgruppe disintegrated and his reputation collapsed from brilliant spearhead to trapped fugitive, some soldiers would describe Piper as the best commander they'd ever served under. Others would describe him as a war criminal who'd gotten them all killed for nothing. Both descriptions were probably true. War doesn't require consistent personalities. It reveals them in fragments, and Piper was revealed as someone capable of both tactical brilliance and moral monstrosity, sometimes in the same hour. As darkness fell on December 17th, Piper made the decision to push his column through the night towards Stavelot despite fog, despite exhaustion, despite the fact that his vehicles had been moving for 36 hours straight. He radioed his lead tank commander, a veteran named Arnaud Fischer, commanding Panther No. 731, with simple instructions: advance to Stavelot, seize the bridge, hold until the main column arrives. Fischer acknowledged, and his Panther lurched forward into the darkness, followed by 4 more Panthers and a company of SS infantry in half-tracks. They were 5 kilometers from Stavelot, 5 kilometers from the bridge that would open the road to the Meuse. 5 kilometers from discovering whether reputation and speed were enough to win battles, or whether sometimes even the best plans shatter against unexpected resistance. Piper climbed back into Sur, his command half-track, and followed his lead tanks into the fog. Behind him, stretching 25 kilometers back toward Germany, 600 vehicles ground forward through the night. Ahead, in Stavelot, 500 American engineers waited in foxholes with 3 bazookas and a prayer. December 10, 1944, 1 week before Stavelot, Staff Sergeant William Hunsicker of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion walked through what had become the largest American fuel depot in Belgium and tried to comprehend the sheer scale of what he was supposed to guard. The depot occupied several fields along the road between Stavelot and Francorchamps, and it had grown organically over the past months as the Allied advance consumed gasoline faster than the supply system could deliver it forward. What had started as a temporary dump for a few thousand gallons had metastasized into a sprawling complex of fuel storage that now contained approximately 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, enough to fill 40,000 jeeps, or run 500 tanks for a month, or keep an entire armored division mobile for 2 weeks of continuous operations. The fuel sat in 5-gallon jerry cans stacked in pyramids and in 55-gallon drums arranged in neat rows that stretched hundreds of meters. From the hills above Stavelot, the depot looked like a geometric garden of metal containers, glinting in the winter sun, when the fog cleared enough to let light through. The fuel depot's existence was an open secret that somehow never made it onto German intelligence maps with the urgency it deserved. American logistics officers knew about it, obviously. They had created it by ordering fuel forward to supply the divisions preparing to push into Germany. Belgian civilians knew about it because they'd watched American trucks arrive daily for weeks, unloading containers by the thousands. Even some German reconnaissance patrols must have known about it because the depot wasn't camouflaged and made no effort at concealment beyond being located slightly outside Stavelot proper. But in the chaos of December 1944, with hundreds of targets competing for intelligence priority, the Stavelot fuel depot never rose to the level of operational significance in German planning. If someone had marked it on Piper's map with the notation 2.5 million gallons here, the entire operational plan might have been different. Piper might have been ordered to seize the fuel first and then continue west. The entire offensive might have pivoted around Stavelot rather than treating it as just another road junction. Captain John T. Pryor commanded the fuel depot with a staff of approximately 30 men and a security detachment of 12 soldiers from Hunsicker's battalion. Pryor was a logistics officer, not a combat commander, and his primary concerns up to December 17th involved inventory management, distribution, schedules, and the endless paperwork that military bureaucracy demanded even in combat zones. The security arrangements were minimal because the depot was 15 kilometers behind what everyone considered a stable front line. Hunsicker's 12 guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles, checked passes on vehicles entering the depot, and spent most of their time bored. The defensive preparations consisted of a few foxholes dug around the perimeter and some hasty barbed wire that wouldn't stop a determined squad, let alone a panzer column. Nobody had considered what would happen if German tanks suddenly appeared, because German tanks appearing 15 kilometers behind the lines was supposed to be impossible. The entire security apparatus was designed to prevent pilferage and accidents, not to repel an armored assault. The fuel itself represented American industrial capacity, translated into liquid form. Thousands of barrels refined in Texas and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that dodged U-boats, pumped into trucks at Antwerp and Cherbourg, driven to Belgium over highways built by engineers like the 291st, and finally stockpiled here to supply the divisions that would end the war. Every gallon represented a tiny victory in the vast logistical war that ultimately mattered more than any individual battle. The Germans knew this, which is why their entire offensive plan counted on capturing Allied fuel. The panzer divisions assigned to Wacht am Rhein, the operation's German codename, had been allocated only enough fuel for approximately 150 kilometers of travel, assuming minimal resistance and perfect road conditions. The actual distance to the Meuse River and beyond was over 200 kilometers through mountainous terrain where tanks consumed fuel at double the normal rate. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. German panzers couldn't reach their objectives on the fuel they carried. They had to capture Allied fuel depots to continue advancing. Every gallon mattered. December 17th, 1944, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain Pryor received his first fragmentary report about the German offensive from a military policeman who'd passed through Stavelot heading west. The information was confused and second-hand. Something about a major breakthrough, German tanks near Malmedy, entire divisions possibly encircled. Pryor asked if he should evacuate the fuel depot or prepare it for destruction. The MP didn't know. Pryor contacted his superior headquarters and received an equally unhelpful response: stand by for further orders. So, Pryor stood by, maintaining normal operations while his staff continued loading fuel onto trucks that arrived from units that still thought they'd be advancing into Germany next week. The gap between what was happening at the front and what rear area commands understood was happening would characterize the first 72 hours of the Bulge. Orders arrived late or not at all. Units improvised based on fragmentary information. Decisions that would determine victory or defeat were made by captains and sergeants who had no idea they were making decisions that mattered. Hunsicker spent the evening of December 17th reinforcing his 12-man guard detail and trying to calculate how long they could hold if German tanks actually arrived. The math was depressing. He had 12 riflemen with M1 Garands effective to maybe 400 meters. He had 130 caliber machine gun effective to about 800 meters. He had no bazookas, no anti-tank weapons, no anti-tank mines. If a single Panther tank rolled up to the depot perimeter, his options were basically to shoot at it with rifles, which would accomplish nothing except announce his position or run. Hunsicker was a practical man who'd survived Normandy by understanding his limitations. His mission was depot security, not tank fighting. If German armor appeared, the sensible thing would be to withdraw and let someone else deal with it. But that assumed there would be time to withdraw and someone else available to deal with it. On the evening of December 17th, both assumptions were increasingly questionable. The strategic value of the Stavelot fuel depot cannot be overstated, yet it was almost completely unstated at the time because nobody on the Allied side imagined it would be threatened. If Piper had captured the depot intact, not impossible given how lightly it was defended, his Kampfgruppe would have gained enough fuel to reach the Meuse River with enough remaining to support follow-on operations. The entire offensive might have taken a different trajectory. Instead of culminating at La Glaise after running out of fuel, Piper could have refueled at Stavelot and continued west, potentially reaching the Meuse bridges before American reinforcements could destroy them. The captured fuel wouldn't have been enough to win the war for Germany that was already beyond possibility in December 1944. But it might have extended the offensive for days or weeks, costing thousands of additional casualties and potentially changing the timeline of the war's end. All of this hung on whether Piper would discover the depot's existence, and whether anyone would defend it if he did. Belgian railway workers who lived near the depot watched the American preparations with growing alarm. One worker, whose name appears in Belgian records as Marcel Dubois, later testified that he approached Captain Pryor on the evening of December 17th and asked in broken English whether the Americans planned to destroy the fuel if Germans came. Pryor said he had no orders to destroy anything. Dubois asked what would happen if German tanks captured all that fuel. Pryor said he didn't think German tanks could get this far. Dubois gestured at the columns of American vehicles streaming west through Stavelot, trucks, jeeps, ambulances, all heading away from the front. "They are running," Dubois said. "Who will fight?" Pryor had no answer. The question would be answered over the next 72 hours, but not in any way that the textbooks would have predicted. The fuel depot at Stavelot would survive not because of brilliant planning or overwhelming force, but because of a series of small decisions and random chances that prevented Piper from recognizing what sat just beyond the bridge he was about to attack. As darkness fell on December 17th, the fuel depot continued normal operations. Trucks arrived, received their loads, and departed. Staff tallied inventory, 2,460,000 gallons of gasoline as of 1800 hours, plus various lubricants and diesel fuel. Security patrols walked their rounds. Captain Pryor wrote his daily report and filed it with headquarters, noting no significant activity. At the same moment, 5 kilometers east, in Stavelot itself, Major Solis was positioning his engineers to defend a bridge. And 8 kilometers beyond that in Ligneville, Piper was studying his map by flashlight and calculating how quickly he could reach that bridge. None of them knew about the other's plans. None of them understood how the next 72 hours would transform Stavelot from an obscure Belgian town into a decisive battlefield. The fuel depot sat quietly in its fields, 2.5 million gallons of potential catastrophe, guarded by 12 men with rifles. Tomorrow would reveal whether that was sufficient or insane. The story of the Stavelot fuel depot is ultimately a story about strategic blindness on both sides. American commanders who couldn't imagine it being threatened, and German commanders who didn't recognize its value until too late. In the vast complexity of military operations, where decisions cascade through layers of command and information arrives in fragments, the fuel depot was simultaneously the most important objective in the sector and invisible to the people who most needed to target or defend it. This kind of strategic blindness is common in warfare. Battles are often decided not by the objectives commanders prioritize, but by the ones they overlook. Stavelot would become one of those battles, and the fuel depot would haunt both sides' after-action reports like a ghost at a funeral, present in every analysis, absent from the actual fighting. The men who would fight for Stavelot's bridge had no idea they were also fighting to protect 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, sitting in fields they couldn't see and barely knew existed. Sometimes the most important objectives are the ones nobody's been told to defend. December 17, 1944, 6 o'clock in the evening. Major Paul Solis sat in what passed for the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's command post. A requisitioned stone house in Stavelot with a field telephone, a radio that worked intermittently, and a map spread across a kitchen table. He'd just received orders from higher headquarters that were simultaneously crystal clear and completely impossible. Hold Stavelot at all costs. Solis was 34 years old, a civil engineer from Pennsylvania who'd been commissioned in 1942 and spent the past 2 years building bridges across Europe. He commanded approximately 500 men of Company C and attached units from the battalion, and not one of them had been trained as infantry. They were specialists, demolition experts who knew how to blow up bridges, not defend them. Construction workers who operated bulldozers and transit levels. Survey teams who measured distances for pontoon bridges. They carried rifles because everyone in the army carried rifles, but their primary weapons were supposed to be jackhammers and welding torches. Now, they were supposed to stop an SS Panzer column. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had a distinguished record that involved exactly 0 days of sustained infantry combat. Since landing at Normandy in June of 1944, they'd built or repaired 73 bridges across France and Belgium. They'd cleared minefields and repaired roads and constructed dozens of river crossings that allowed American armor to advance. They'd been shot at occasionally. Engineers working near the front line were always exposed to artillery and small arms fire, but they'd never been asked to hold ground against a deliberate assault. Their training emphasized technical skills over tactical ones. A typical engineer could calculate the load-bearing capacity of a Bailey Bridge in his sleep, but might struggle to set up interlocking fields of fire for a defensive perimeter. They knew how much TNT it took to drop a bridge span, but not necessarily how to establish a fighting position that could survive artillery bombardment. They were bridge builders being asked to become tank killers, and the transformation would have to happen overnight. Sergeant Charles Hensel embodied the improvisation that characterized the 291st's defense. Hensel was a demolition specialist, which meant he understood explosives better than anyone in the battalion. On the evening of December 17th, he conducted an inventory of anti-tank weapons and discovered the battalion had 3 M9 bazookas, approximately 20 rockets total, and absolutely nothing else designed to stop armor. No anti-tank mines. They'd used all of theirs clearing German minefields during the advance. No anti-tank guns. Those belonged to specialized units that weren't present in Stavelot. Not even any anti-tank grenades beyond standard fragmentation grenades that would bounce harmlessly off tank armor. Hensel's entire anti-tank arsenal consisted of 3 tube-launched weapons that required crews to get within 100 meters of a tank, aim at weak spots in the armor, and hope. The shape-charge warhead penetrated before the tank's machine guns killed the crew. It was inadequate to the point of absurdity, but it was what they had. Hensel positioned his 3 bazooka teams with care born of desperation. The first team went into a stone house overlooking the main highway, approaching Stavelot from the east, with instructions to wait until German tanks were within 75 meters before firing, close enough to ensure penetration, far enough to hopefully allow escape after firing. The second team positioned near the bridge itself, hoping to catch tanks as they slowed to cross the narrow span. The third team Hensel kept mobile, moving between positions based on wherever the threat developed. Each team consisted of 2 men, a gunner who aimed and fired, and a loader who handled the rockets and watched for additional targets. Hensel briefed each team personally, emphasizing that they'd probably get 1 shot before being suppressed by return fire, so that 1 shot had to count. Aim for side armor or rear armor, never frontal armor. Aim for engine compartments or turret rings. And if the shot missed or failed to penetrate, don't reload, drop the bazooka and run, because a missed shot meant the tank knew where you were. Private Bernard Goldstein spent December 17th building roadblocks, which felt simultaneously crucial and pointless. Goldstein was a surveyor whose peacetime job had involved measuring property boundaries in New Jersey. Now he was dragging Belgian furniture and abandoned vehicles into Highway N23, constructing barriers designed to slow tanks that weighed 50 tons and had been specifically engineered to crush obstacles. The roadblock he and 5 other engineers completed by 10 o'clock that night was impressive as improvised obstacles go. A 3-meter-high pile incorporating an entire cafe's worth of tables and chairs, 2 abandoned American trucks positioned nose to nose, felled trees dragged from nearby, woods, coils of barbed wire, and various debris scavenged from around town. It looked formidable. It would probably delay a Panther tank for about 30 seconds. But 30 seconds was 30 seconds. Time for a bazooka team to take aim. Time for defenders to reposition. Time for something unexpected to happen. Defensive warfare often comes down to stealing seconds and praying they accumulate into minutes. Captain John Conlon commanded Company C's 3rd Platoon and spent the evening positioning his men in buildings overlooking the highway. Conlon was a practical officer who had learned in Normandy that defensive positions survived by having multiple fallback positions and clear routes of withdrawal. He assigned each squad a primary fighting position in stone buildings that offered some protection against tank fire, then designated secondary positions they could fall back to if the primary positions became untenable. The plan assumed that his engineers would fight from buildings rather than foxholes, using windows and doors as firing positions while the stone walls absorbed incoming fire. It was urban warfare tactics learned on the fly by people who'd never been trained in urban warfare. Conlon walked through each position personally, showing his men where to aim, when to fire, when to displace. He told them what he believed and what they needed to hear. They could hold if they fought smart and used the terrain. He didn't tell them what he also believed, that against a full Panzer column, their chances ranged from slim to none. First Sergeant William Krickenberger faced the challenge of assigning defensive positions to men who'd never been in sustained combat. Krickenberger was a veteran of the North African campaign who'd transferred to the 291st from an infantry unit, which made him probably the most tactically experienced soldier in Stavelot that night. He knew that defensive lines held or broke based largely on whether soldiers knew what to expect and how to react. So he spent hours moving between positions, talking to his men, explaining what would probably happen tomorrow. German tanks would come down the highway, probably at dawn. American bazookas would try to stop them. Rifle fire would be mostly useless against armor, but essential for suppressing German infantry. The key was staying calm, picking targets, and not running unless ordered to fall back. Krickenberger had fought in enough battles to know that half of soldiering was just not panicking, and the other half was convincing other people not to panic. That evening in Stavelot, convincing engineers not to panic seemed like a tall order. Lieutenant Arch Taylor drew the most critical assignment, defending the bridge itself. Taylor commanded a platoon that included the battalion's best demolition experts, and his orders were contradictory in a way that would become characteristic of the battle. Defend the bridge, but be prepared to destroy it if defense failed, but don't destroy it unless absolutely necessary, because higher headquarters might need it for counterattacks, but don't let Germans capture it intact. Taylor spent hours examining the bridge's stone structure, calculating how much explosive would be needed to drop at least one span. The bridge was solid, 19th century construction built to last centuries, with stone piers sunk deep into the Amblève River bed. Dropping it would require significant explosive charges placed precisely at load-bearing points. Taylor's demolition teams began preparing charges, running detonation cord, and testing firing circuits. But they didn't actually place the charges on the bridge because orders prohibited that until authorization came from higher command. So, the charges sat in boxes near the bridge, ready to install but not installed. It was the kind of military logic that makes perfect sense until combat starts. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's position on December 17th represented both a failure and a triumph of American military planning. The failure was obvious. Combat engineers shouldn't be fighting as infantry, and the fact that they were revealed gaps in the defensive planning that allowed an SS Panzer column to penetrate this deeply, this quickly. But the triumph was that the engineers were there at all. In previous wars, rear area units facing armor attacks typically fled. Engineers in particular, valuable specialists whose training took months, were not supposed to be risked in direct combat. But the 291st didn't run. Maybe they didn't run because they had orders to hold. Maybe they didn't run because there was nowhere to run to. Maybe they didn't run because American military culture by late 1944 had internalized the lesson that running just meant dying somewhere else. Whatever the reason, 500 construction workers decided to fight tanks, and that decision would matter. As midnight approached on December 17th, Major Solis made his final tour of the defensive positions. He walked through town in near total darkness, checking foxholes and fighting positions, making sure ammunition was distributed, reminding soldiers to hold their fire until targets were clearly identified. Solis carried himself with a calmness he didn't entirely feel, because he knew his men were watching him for signs of confidence or fear. At the bridge, he found Lieutenant Taylor supervising the placement of security posts. On the eastern edge of town, he found Sergeant Hensel adjusting the position of a bazooka team. In each location, Solis delivered the same message. Tomorrow would be difficult, but they had good positions and enough firepower to make the Germans pay for every meter. It was what officers said before battles, and whether it was true mattered less than whether people believed it. Solis walked back to his command post around midnight and sat down at the map table. In a few hours, he'd discover whether engineers could defend what they'd normally build. The question wasn't whether they had the weapons. Clearly they didn't. The question was whether they had the will. Wars are often decided by people who refuse to lose even when losing seems inevitable. Tomorrow would test whether the 291st had that quality. December 17th, 1944. 11:45 at night. Lieutenant Arch Taylor stood at his position near the Stavelot Bridge, staring into fog so thick he could barely see 30 meters. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and moisture from the Amblève River mixed with ground fog to create a gray wall that swallowed sound and sight. Taylor commanded the bridge defense, approximately 40 engineers positioned in buildings and foxholes covering the approaches to the span. They'd been at full alert for 3 hours, listening to reports from outposts that German vehicles were approaching, getting closer, estimated at 1 kilometer, now 800 meters, now impossible to tell because the fog distorted everything. Then Taylor heard it, a sound like no truck or half-track, a deep mechanical grinding that seemed to make the ground vibrate. Through the fog, perhaps 400 meters distant, he glimpsed movement, something massive and angular, its silhouette darker than the darkness. A tank. Maybe more than one. Taylor's throat went dry. This was it. The German tank approaching through the fog was Panther No. 731, commanded by SS Untersturmführer Arndt Fischer, and Fischer had been driving for 36 hours straight with minimal rest. His crew was exhausted, his vision was limited to what he could see through periscopes in near-zero visibility, and his orders were to reach the Stavelot Bridge and secure it before Americans could organize a defense. Fischer's Panther was the lead element of Piper's spearhead. Behind him stretched 4 more Panthers and a company of SS infantry and half-tracks. Fischer could see lights in Stavelot, which surprised him because it suggested the Americans either didn't know he was coming or didn't care. That didn't match intelligence reports, but intelligence reports had been wrong about everything else in this offensive. Fischer's tank ground forward down the slope toward the bridge at perhaps 10 kilometers per hour, slow enough to navigate in the fog, but fast enough to maintain momentum. The bridge was right there, 400 meters, maybe less. Just drive straight through whatever resistance existed and secure the crossing. Midnight exactly. Taylor saw the Panther emerge from the fog at approximately 300 meters, close enough now that he could make out its sloped frontal armor and long 75mm gun. For perhaps 3 seconds, nobody fired. The tank continued rolling forward. Then Taylor shouted the order, and a .30 caliber machine gun positioned in a building to his left opened fire. Tracer rounds arced through, the darkness in brilliant red-orange lines converging on the Panther's hull. The sound was deafening in the quiet night, a sustained hammering that echoed off buildings. Rounds struck the tank's armor and ricocheted in showers of sparks, the bullets deflecting at wild angles because .30 caliber ammunition couldn't penetrate tank armor at any range. But the gunner kept firing anyway, pouring rounds into the Panther, and the visual effect was spectacular even if the tactical effect was zero. The tank stopped. Its turret began traversing left, searching for the machine gun's position. Taylor realized they had seconds before that 75mm cannon fired back. Sergeant Charles Hensel watched the tracer fire from his position 70 meters to the right of the machine gun and understood immediately that the machine gunner had just signed his own death warrant. You didn't shoot tracers at tanks from a fixed position unless you wanted the tank to kill you, but the machine gunfire had accomplished something crucial. It had stopped in the Panther's advance and revealed its exact position. Hensel grabbed the shoulder of Private Robert Mackenzie, his bazooka gunner, and pointed at the Panther's silhouette. Mackenzie raised the bazooka to his shoulder, aimed at the tank's turret ring where armor was thinnest, and squeezed the trigger. The bazooka erupted with a flash and a whoosh, the shaped charge rocket streaking across the darkness. It struck the Panther's turret at the junction between turret and hull. The explosion was sharp and bright, a concentrated blast of molten metal designed to burn through armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Panther's engine revved high, the tank reversed violently, and figures began bailing out of the hatches. Hensel couldn't believe it. One shot, one hit. The Panther was retreating. 12:03 in the morning, December 18th. Piper arrived at Fisher's position to discover his lead tank stopped 400 meters from the bridge and Fisher's crew standing beside their Panther, arguing about whether the vehicle was actually damaged. Piper was furious. He'd driven through 36 hours of fog and delays and unexpected resistance. And now his carefully calculated timetable was falling apart because his lead tank had been hit by a single bazooka round and stopped. Piper examined the tank personally with a flashlight. The bazooka had scored the turret ring but hadn't penetrated. The crew had panicked and abandoned a perfectly functional vehicle. Piper ordered them back into the tank and told Fisher to resume the advance immediately. Fisher protested that they couldn't see anything in the fog, that American anti-tank weapons were positioned ahead, that rushing the bridge in darkness was suicide. Piper's response was documented in multiple post-war testimonies. He told Fisher that suicide was preferable to cowardice, then softened slightly and agreed to probe American positions with infantry before committing more tanks. The next 2 hours became a deadly game of blind man's bluff as German infantry attempted to feel out American positions without being massacred in the process. SS infantry squads moved forward in the fog, staying off the main road, trying to infiltrate through buildings and side streets. They encountered American engineers who'd positioned themselves in houses specifically to cover these approaches. Firefights erupted at ranges of 20 to 30 meters, Germans and Americans shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, neither side able to see clearly. Private Bernard Goldstein found himself firing his M1 Garand at shapes moving through fog, cycling through 8-round clips as fast as he could reload, having no idea if he was hitting anything. 2 buildings down, another engineer killed a German soldier at 10 meters with a rifle shot, then discovered 2 more Germans behind him and barely escaped through a back window. The fighting was chaotic and personal and terrifying in the way close-quarters combat always is. By 2 o'clock in the morning, German probes had cost them 8 men killed or wounded. American casualties were 2 wounded. More importantly, the Americans still held their positions. Piper made the decision around 2:15 in the morning that would haunt his after-action analysis for decades. He ordered his column to halt and wait for daylight. The decision was tactically sound. Attacking across a bridge in darkness against an enemy of unknown strength was exactly the kind of risk that lost wars. But it cost him 6 hours of darkness, during which American reinforcements might arrive, and American engineers might wire the bridge for demolition. Piper's entire operational concept depended on speed, and now he was deliberately choosing caution. He later claimed that the decision was forced on him by impossible visibility and unexpectedly strong resistance. Critics would argue that the old Piper, the one who'd driven into Paris in 1940 or raced across Russia in 1941, would have attacked anyway, and damn the risks. Something had changed, maybe exhaustion, maybe the accumulated weight of 36 hours of combat, maybe a subconscious recognition that this offensive was already failing. Whatever the reason, Piper stopped. His column stretched back 25 kilometers toward Germany, and all of it stopped because he stopped. In Stavelot, 500 engineers who should have been dead were still alive. Lieutenant Taylor spent the hours between 2 and 6 in the morning preparing for the inevitable daylight assault. He knew the Germans would come again, and next time they'd come with overwhelming force. Taylor positioned additional bazooka teams, redistributed ammunition, and worked with his demolition experts to pre-stage charges that could be quickly placed on the bridge if authorization came. The charges sat in boxes near the bridge abutments. 50-pound blocks of TNT, coils of detonation cord, and blasting caps in protective containers. Everything was ready except the actual placing and wiring, which couldn't happen without orders from higher headquarters. Taylor sent runners requesting permission to wire the bridge for demolition. The runners returned with no response. Communications were breaking down as the scope of the German offensive became clear. So, Taylor waited and watched the fog gradually thin as dawn approached. Behind him, the Amblève River flowed dark and cold, indifferent to the fact that battles would be fought over the span that crossed it. Major Solis received his first reinforcement around 3 o'clock in the morning. A liaison officer from the 30th Infantry Division arrived with news that elements of the division were moving towards Stavelot and should arrive by midday. It wasn't enough. Solis needed anti-tank guns and armor and artillery support, not a promise of reinforcements in 9 hours. But it was something. It meant they weren't completely alone. Solis radioed orders to all positions: hold until relieved, conserve ammunition, prepare fallback positions if primary positions became untenable. The orders were professional and precise, and didn't acknowledge the obvious fact that if the Germans attacked in force before reinforcements arrived, the 291st would be annihilated. Solis sat in his command post as dawn approached and calculated odds. 500 engineers with inadequate weapons against perhaps 5,000 SS troops with tanks. Mathematics suggested retreat. Duty demanded defense. Solis chose duty, partly because his orders required it, and partly because running would have been both tactically pointless and morally impossible. The engineers had held through the night, they'd hold through the day, or they'd die trying. The first contact at Stavelot revealed patterns that would characterize the entire battle. German technical superiority negated by American tactical flexibility, darkness and fog equalizing combat power, small units achieving disproportionate effects through proper positioning and sheer determination. One bazooka round hadn't destroyed a Panther, but it had stopped a Panther, and stopping was almost as good as destroying when the goal was preventing breakthrough. The machine gunner who'd fired tracers at a tank had been reckless to the point of suicide, but his recklessness had frozen the German advance at a critical moment. The infantry firefights in the fog had cost Germans more casualties than Americans because the Americans were defending prepared positions while the Germans were attacking blind. None of this guaranteed American victory. Piper still had overwhelming force and would use it at dawn, but it bought time. In defensive warfare, time is the currency that matters most. The 291st had purchased 6 hours with 2 wounded and 0 killed. In a few hours, they'd discover what that time had. Bought them. December 18th, 1944, 6:15 in the morning. Madame Renée Gregoire huddled in the wine cellar beneath her house with 30 neighbors and family members as the world above them began to explode. The German artillery barrage started without warning, shells whistling in from the east and detonating across Stavelot in a systematic pattern designed to suppress defensive positions and terrorize defenders. Madame Gregoire had lived through the German invasion of 1940 and thought she understood what artillery sounded like. But this was different. This was concentrated and deliberate, shells landing every few seconds, some exploding on impact and others penetrating roofs before exploding inside buildings. The stone walls of her cellar shook with each nearby detonation. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. A child began crying, and her mother tried to muffle the sound with her hand, as if German artillery crews could hear crying over their own bombardment. Madame Gregoire prayed in French, a continuous whispered stream of Notre Père, that gave her something to focus on, besides the certainty that the ceiling would collapse and bury them all. The barrage lasted 27 minutes and expended approximately 400 shells. Not a massive bombardment by Eastern Front standards, but devastating for a small town where defensive positions were clustered in a few dozen buildings. Piper had brought forward his assault guns and artillery during the night, positioning them on hills overlooking Stavelot, and now he was using them to methodically destroy any building that might contain American defenders. 105mm shells struck the stone house where the machine gunner had fired at his Panther the night before. The building's facade exploded, sending stone blocks tumbling into the street. Smaller 75mm rounds from self-propelled guns walked along the main highway, searching for roadblocks and defensive positions. Mortar shells, 80mm rounds fired in high arcs, dropped behind buildings where German observers suspected American reserves might be sheltering. The bombardment was textbook combined arms warfare. Suppress the defenders, destroy their positions, and prepare the way for armor to advance. Private Ernest Bechtel experienced the barrage from a second-story room in a building overlooking the highway, and his experience was probably representative of what 200 engineers endured that morning. The first shell hit 2 buildings away. Bechtel heard the whistle scream and then the detonation, close enough that the shockwave rattled windows. He dropped flat on the floor, crawling toward the window to maintain his firing position while staying below the window line. More shells landed, walking closer. One struck the building across the street, and Bechtel watched the entire front wall collapse in a cloud of dust and stone fragments. Another hit the street itself, the explosion sending cobblestones flying like shrapnel. Bechtel's ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. His hands shook as he gripped his M1 Garand. He'd been in combat since Normandy, but artillery barrages never got easier. Each shell was random death. You couldn't shoot back, couldn't do anything except press yourself into whatever cover existed and pray the next one landed somewhere else. 7 o'clock in the morning. The barrage stopped, and in the sudden silence that followed, Bechtel heard something worse than artillery, the grinding roar of multiple tank engines. He risked a look over the windowsill and saw them coming down the highway. Panthers, at least 12 of them, spread across the roadway in a formation designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer firepower. Behind the Panthers came half-tracks loaded with SS infantry. Bechtel's roadblock, the pile of furniture and trucks and trees that Bernard Goldstein had built, sat directly in the Panthers' path. The lead Panther didn't slow down. It hit the roadblock at perhaps 20 kilometers per hour, and the barricade exploded in all directions. Tables and chairs and a Belgian armoire launched into the air. The truck position nose down in the roadblock was shoved aside like cardboard. The Panther ground through the debris without even slowing. Behind it, more Panthers followed, and behind them came the half-tracks. Stavelot's defense was collapsing before the attack had even fully developed. Sergeant Charles Hensel's bazooka team engaged the lead Panthers from a building 75 meters from the highway. Private Mackenzie aimed carefully at the second Panther in line. The lead tank was already past their angle of fire, and launched. The rocket streaked across the street and struck the Panther's side armor at the junction between hull and turret. The explosion was violent and satisfying, and for a moment, Hensel thought they'd achieved a kill. Then the Panther's turret traversed toward their position with mechanical precision, and Hensel realized the hit hadn't penetrated. The Panther's 75mm cannon fired once, a flat crack followed by the shriek of an armor-piercing round passing through air. The shell hit Hensel's building in the room directly below where his team was positioned. The explosion blew out the first floor's interior walls, and the second floor sagged. Hensel and Mackenzie scrambled for the stairs, reaching the ground floor just as another shell hit. The building was collapsing behind them as they ran out the back door into an alley. Behind them, more American positions were taking fire, more engineers were withdrawing, and Piper's armor was rolling through Stavelot like nothing could stop it. 7:45 in the morning. The German assault reached the town center, and the fighting became personal and brutal. SS infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and began clearing, building systematically, grenades through windows, bursts of machine pistol fire into rooms, methodical room-to-room advances that gave defenders no time to regroup. Private Bechtel found himself trapped in his second-story position as Germans entered the building below. He heard boots on stairs, guttural German voices coordinating the assault. Bechtel aimed his Garand at the stairway door and waited, finger on trigger, knowing he'd get maybe 1 or 2 shots before being overwhelmed. The door burst open. Bechtel fired twice, and a German soldier fell backward. Then the window behind Bechtel exploded as a Panther's machine gun raked the room. Bechtel dove through a different doorway into an adjacent room, ran to a window on the building's rear side, and simply jumped, a 3-meter drop into a courtyard. He landed badly, twisting his ankle, but he was alive and outside the building. Other engineers were fleeing through streets and alleys, falling back to positions south of the Sewer, bridge that Major Solis had designated as fallback lines. 8:15 in the morning. Lieutenant Arch Taylor faced the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Blow the bridge or don't blow the bridge. German tanks were 200 meters away and closing. American defenders were being overrun. Taylor's demolition charges sat in boxes near the bridge abutments, ready to be placed, but not yet placed because headquarters still hadn't authorized bridge demolition. Taylor made an executive decision: place the charges now, authorization or not. His demolition team ran onto the bridge under fire, carrying 50-pound blocks of TNT and coils of detonation cord. They worked frantically, setting charges against the stone piers, running wire, connecting blasting caps. German machine gun fire kicked up sparks on the bridge deck. One demolition specialist was hit and fell, his body tumbling into the Amblève River below. The others kept working. They completed the circuit, ran the firing wire back to the south bank, and connected it to the blasting machine. Taylor took the handles, ready to twist and send electrical current to the caps. He twisted. Nothing happened. He twisted again, harder. Still nothing. The charges failed to detonate. The bridge demolition failure at Stavelot has been analyzed and debated by military historians for decades, and the exact cause remains disputed. Lieutenant Taylor's report claimed the blasting caps were wet from condensation and failed to fire. Other witnesses suggested the firing wire had been cut by shell fragments. Some engineers believed insufficient explosive had been used, that even if the caps had fired, the charges wouldn't have dropped the bridge. Post-war German accounts claim they saw American engineers placing charges and immediately sent a squad to cut the firing wire, which may or may not be accurate. What's certain is that at 8:15 on the morning of December 18th, with German tanks 200 meters from the bridge, the demolition charges didn't work. Taylor abandoned the blasting machine and ordered his team to withdraw. Panthers rolled onto the bridge. The span held. German tanks crossed the Amblève River intact and began pushing west toward the fuel depot. 8:30 in the morning. Major Solis ordered a general withdrawal to high ground south of Stavelot. The town center was lost. The bridge was lost. His engineers were streaming back in disorder, some units maintaining cohesion, while others had fragmented into individuals and small groups. Solis established a new defensive line on hills overlooking Stavelot from the south, positions that offered good observation of the town and the bridge, but gave up the urban terrain that had provided cover during the night battle. It was a fighting retreat, not a rout, but the distinction mattered less than the result. Stavelot had fallen in 90 minutes of assault. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had inflicted casualties, probably 20 German soldiers killed, maybe 2 tanks damaged, but they'd lost the town and the bridge. American casualties included 23 killed, 44 wounded, and approximately 50 captured when their positions were overrun. Piper's column now controlled the key junction and had a clear road west toward the Meuse River. The fall of Stavelot on the morning of December 18th seemed to validate everything German planners had predicted. Speed and shock would overcome American defenses, bridges would be captured intact, and the road to the Meuse would open. Piper's lead tanks were already pushing west beyond Stavelot, racing toward the fuel depot and the open tank country beyond. If the offensive had ended at noon on December 18th, Stavelot would have been remembered as another German tactical victory in a campaign of tactical victories. But the offensive didn't end at noon. It was barely beginning. The engineers had lost the town, but they'd bought time, 36 hours between first contact and German breakthrough, 36 hours for American commanders to recognize the offensive scale and start moving reinforcements. The 291st had held longer than anyone had a right to expect. Now the question was whether that time had been enough for help to arrive, or whether Piper's gamble on speed would pay off despite the delay. The answers were coming. They were coming from the south, from the 30th Infantry Division, and they were coming angry. December 18th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. Major Paul Solis stood on a hill south of Stavelot, watching German tanks roll through the town center below and wondering how long his shattered engineer battalion could hold their new positions. Then he heard American voices behind him, turned, and saw something he'd stopped expecting: reinforcements. Colonel William B. Lovelady was climbing the hill with staff officers from 1st Battalion, 1's 117th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had fought from Normandy through France and Belgium. Lovelady had a map, and he was pointing at Stavelot. Solis started to brief him on the tactical situation. Germans control the town, bridges intact, my engineers are holding hills to the south. But Lovelady interrupted. "We're not holding hills," Lovelady said. "We're taking the town back. Now." Solis blinked, recalculating everything. Engineers didn't counterattack into towns full of SS panzers, but infantry did, and infantry had just arrived. The 30th Infantry Division's deployment to Stavelot represented American military flexibility at its best and organizational chaos at its messiest. The division had been in reserve positions preparing for routine operations when word of the German offensive arrived on December 17th. Division headquarters received fragmentary reports throughout the day: breakthrough at multiple points, armor penetrations, entire regiments out of contact. By evening, the situation was clear enough to demand action, but unclear enough that nobody knew where to commit reserves. The 30th Division was ordered south toward the breakthrough, but specific objectives kept changing as the front line dissolved. 1st Battalion, 117th Infantry, was initially dispatched toward Malmedy, then diverted to Stavelot when reports indicated German armor had reached the Amblève. The battalion arrived piecemeal, companies straggling in throughout the morning of December 18th after night movements through congested roads. Lovelady arrived with maybe 500 men immediately available, another 300 expected within hours, and orders to restore the situation at Stavelot, restore the situation against an SS Panzer battle group. It was either courageous or insane. 10:30 in the morning. Staff Sergeant Raymond Lamp commanded a squad in Company A-100, 17th Infantry, and he'd been awake for 30 hours straight when Lovelady's orders arrived. Attack into Stavelot from the south. Objective is to cut the German supply route and retake the southern half of town. Lamp had fought in enough battles to know that attacking into urban terrain against defending armor was among the worst assignments infantry could receive. Tanks in towns were nearly impossible to kill without proper anti-tank weapons, and proper anti-tank weapons apparently meant 3 M10 tank destroyers that were supposed to support the attack but hadn't arrived yet. Lamp's squad had rifles, 1 Browning automatic rifle, 2 bazookas with 8 rockets between them, and orders to attack. He gathered his men and explained the plan, which was less a plan than a concept. Move fast, stay close to buildings so tanks can't depress their guns enough to shoot you, use bazookas on any vehicle targets, and don't stop moving, because stopping meant ding, the American. Counterattack began at 11 o'clock and surprised everyone, including the Americans. Company A advanced into southern Stavelot in 2 columns, moving along side streets to avoid the main highway where German tanks were concentrated. They encountered German supply vehicles, trucks and half-tracks, that had been rolling through Stavelot, assuming the town was secure. The first German truck took rifle fire at 40 meters and crashed into a building. Its occupants bailed out and were cut down by BAR fire from Lamp's squad. A half-track attempted to reverse away from the ambush and was hit by a bazooka round that penetrated its thin armor. Within 15 minutes, the American attack had destroyed 7 German vehicles and killed or wounded approximately 30 German soldiers. More importantly, they had reached the southern edge of Stavelot proper and were setting up defensive positions in buildings that overlooked the main highway. The German supply route was suddenly contested, 11:45 in the morning. The M10 tank destroyers arrived, 3 vehicles from the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion, each mounting a 3-inch main gun capable of penetrating Panther armor at reasonable ranges. The tank destroyers positioned themselves on hills south of Stavelot, where they could observe the highway and the bridge. Staff Sergeant Earl Ramsey commanded 1 M10 crew, and his first priority target appeared within minutes: a German supply column, 15 trucks and several half-tracks, entering Stavelot from the east, apparently unaware that Americans had retaken the southern part of town. Ramsey's gunner ranged the lead vehicle at 800 meters and fired. The 3-inch armor-piercing round hit the truck's engine block and the vehicle exploded in flames. Ramsey's crew reloaded and fired again, hitting a half-track. The other two tank destroyers joined in. The German column was trapped on a narrow road with burning vehicles blocking the front and American positions covering the rear. It was a killing ground. Within 10 minutes, the entire column was destroyed or abandoned. Noon on December 18th. Piper was 8 kilometers west of Stavelot, approaching Le Glaise with his spearhead, 60 tanks and 800 men racing toward the Meuse. Then his radio crackled with reports from his rear echelon. Americans attacking in Stavelot, supply route cut, major casualties. Piper couldn't believe it. Stavelot was supposed to be secure. He'd taken the town, crossed the bridge, and left a security detachment to hold it. Now his entire supply line was being interdicted by Americans who were supposed to be retreating. Piper faced the fundamental dilemma that would define his next week: continue west toward the objective and hope his supply line reopens, or turn back to clear Stavelot and lose momentum. He chose to continue west, ordering his security detachment in Stavelot to hold the bridge at all costs. It was the decision his orders demanded. It was also the decision that would doom his Kampfgruppe by cutting it off from fuel and ammunition. The American counterattack on December 18th split German forces in Stavelot into two segments: Piper's spearhead to the west, increasingly isolated and running on diminishing supplies, and German rear elements to the east, trying to maintain a supply route through a town that was now contested. By noon, Stavelot was effectively divided. Americans controlled the southern half, including the hills overlooking the highway. Germans controlled the bridge and northern approaches, and both sides were fighting for the buildings in between. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat, where advantage belonged to whoever was defending. Buildings changed hands multiple times. A stone house on the main street served as an American strongpoint in the morning, a German position in the afternoon, and would be recaptured by Americans the next day. Casualties on both sides mounted: 35 Americans killed or wounded, approximately 68 Germans killed or wounded by evening. But the critical strategic fact was that Piper's supply line was cut. The unexpected American counterattack at Stavelot demonstrated several military principles simultaneously. First, attacking is often easier than defending when the attacker achieves surprise. German forces in Stavelot had assumed the town was secure and weren't prepared for an immediate counterattack. Second, armor is vulnerable in urban terrain to determined infantry with proper support. The M10 tank destroyers provided crucial anti-armor capability that allowed infantry to operate aggressively. Third, logistics matter more than battles. The American attack didn't destroy Piper's spearhead, but severed its supply line, which would accomplish the same result more slowly and completely. And finally, initiative matters more than plans. Lovelady's decision to counterattack immediately rather than establishing defensive positions reflected an offensive mindset that the Germans hadn't anticipated. The Americans were supposed to be retreating. Instead, they were attacking. Piper's carefully calculated timetable was collapsing. Colonel Lovelady established his command post in a building on the southern edge of Stavelot and assessed the situation at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His battalion controlled roughly half the town. German forces still held the bridge, which meant they could reinforce from the east or retreat west if Piper ordered them back. The fighting had cost Lovelady 35 casualties, but had inflicted greater losses on German supply elements and, more importantly, had cut Piper's logistics. Lovelady's orders from division were to hold Stavelot and prevent German reinforcement west. He'd accomplished half that mission. He was holding half of Stavelot. The other half required taking the bridge. That would be tomorrow's problem. For now, his men were exhausted, ammunition was low, and German tanks were still operating in the northern part of town. Lovelady set up defensive positions, brought forward ammunition and medical supplies, and prepared for the inevitable German counterattacks. The battle for Stavelot wasn't over. It was entering its most brutal phase. Major Solis's engineers integrated into Lovelady's defensive plan, and the partnership between construction workers and infantry created effective combined defenses. Engineers knew the town's layout intimately, which buildings had basements for shelter, which walls were thick enough to stop tank fire, where rubble could be used to create obstacles. Infantry knew how to defend urban terrain against combined arms assault. Together, they created a defensive network in southern Stavelot that would prove remarkably resilient over the next 72 hours. Sergeant Hensel positioned his remaining bazooka teams in buildings where they had clear fields of fire across streets. Germans would have to cross. Infantry squads occupied stone buildings and prepared them for defense, barricading ground floor windows, knocking firing holes through walls, establishing interlocking fields of fire. By nightfall on December 18th, southern Stavelot was a fortress that would have to be taken building by building. The engineers who had been overrun that morning were now dug in and ready. They had retreated once. They wouldn't retreat again. December 18th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sergeant Edmund Dolenc led his squad from Company A, 117 Infantry, toward the Stavelot Bridge with orders that were simple and impossible. Take the bridge. Dolenc was a veteran of Normandy who'd learned that simple orders in combat usually meant someone had decided your life was worth less than the objective. The bridge sat 200 meters ahead, clearly visible across open ground that German machine guns covered from stone houses on the northern bank. Between Dolenc's position and the bridge lay a kill zone, street space with zero cover where anyone advancing would be exposed to fire from 3 directions. Dolenc studied the terrain and made a calculation. His squad could reach the bridge if they moved fast, and German defenders were suppressed. The "if" was doing a lot of work in that calculation. Colonel Lovelady wanted the bridge. Dolenc wanted his squad to survive. The two objectives seemed mutually exclusive. The Stavelot Bridge in December 1944 was an unremarkable piece of 19th century engineering that fate had transformed into the most contested real estate in Belgium. 60 meters long, 8 meters wide, constructed of stone blocks laid by Belgian masons who'd been dead for generations. In peacetime, it carried farm wagons and automobiles. In war, it became a choke point that both sides needed and neither could afford to lose. For Americans, the bridge was the gateway to cutting pipers, supply line, and potentially trapping his entire Kampfgruppe. For Germans, it was the only route for reinforcing Piper or allowing his retreat. The bridge itself had no tactical value. It was just stone and mortar spanning water. But its strategic value was incalculable. Both sides understood this. Both sides would spend the next 36 hours trying to take or hold 50 meters of stone at costs that would have been considered insane in any rational military calculation. Dolenc's attack began with a catastrophe. His squad advanced in bounds across the open ground, and German MG-42 machine guns opened fire from prepared positions in buildings on the north bank. The MG-42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of American machine guns, and the sound was distinctive and terrifying, a ripping cloth noise that signaled incoming death. Dolenc's lead soldier was hit in the legs and went down. 2 more men were hit before the squad even reached the bridge approach. Dolenc and the survivors dove into a drainage ditch that offered minimal cover. They were pinned, couldn't advance, couldn't retreat without being cut down. Dolenc radioed for suppressive fire, and American mortar rounds began landing on the north bank, forcing German gunners to take cover. In the brief lull, Dolenc and his remaining squad members sprinted the last 30 meters to the bridge and threw themselves behind the stone abutment. 3 men wounded, 0 ground gained beyond reaching the bridge they'd been ordered to take. The attack had failed in 4 minutes. 6 o'clock in the evening, December 18th. German combat engineers, Pioniere, arrived at the bridge with orders to wire it for demolition. If Americans were going to contest the bridge this aggressively, German command reasoned they should prepare to destroy it rather than let it fall intact. The Pioniere carried satchel charges and detonation cord, working in the gathering darkness to place explosives against the bridge's stone piers. American mortars had been dropping rounds near the bridge all afternoon, and the Pioniere worked in short bursts between barrages, running onto the bridge to place charges, retreating to cover when mortars fell, returning to wire the charges together. 1 German engineer was killed by mortar fragments, his body left on the bridge deck. The others continued working. By 7 o'clock, they'd placed charges on 3 of the bridge's 4 piers, but they hadn't completed the wiring because American fire made it suicidal to work in the open. The charges sat in place, partially rigged, waiting for someone to complete the circuit. Neither side fully controlled the bridge, and now neither side could use it without risking its destruction. December 19th, 3 o'clock in the morning. Company A, 117th Infantry, launched a night infiltration toward the bridge, and this time they succeeded through a combination of stealth and German exhaustion. Lieutenant James Kirkpatrick led 2 squads forward in absolute silence. No shooting, no grenades, no noise that would alert German defenders. They moved building to building through the southern part of Stavelot, reached the bridge approach, and discovered German defenders were asleep or minimal. Kirkpatrick's men rushed the bridge, surprising 3 German guards who surrendered immediately. Within 15 minutes, Americans controlled the bridge's southern end and had established a hasty defensive position. German forces on the north bank woke to discover Americans had infiltrated to the bridge during darkness. The Germans counterattacked immediately, sending infantry across the bridge in a desperate rush to retake it. The fighting was brutal and personal. Grenades and rifle butts and knives at ranges of 5 meters or less. Bodies fell onto the bridge deck and into the river below. 8 o'clock in the morning, December 19th. Daylight brought armor into the bridge fight, and armor changed everything. A German Panther tank attempted to cross the bridge from north to south, intending to blast American positions at point-blank range. Sergeant Earl Ramsey's M10 tank destroyer spotted the Panther as it approached the bridge at 800 meters. Ramsey's gunner tracked the Panther as it moved onto the bridge, a perfect target silhouetted against the river, unable to maneuver, committed to a narrow path. The gunner fired. The 3-inch armor-piercing round struck the Panther's frontal armor at the junction between hull and glacis plate. The round penetrated. The Panther's ammunition detonated, a secondary explosion that blew the turret 15 feet into the air. The burning hulk blocked the bridge, preventing any further German armor from crossing. German infantry tried to recover the wreck, but were driven back by American rifle fire. The Panther sat on the bridge for the next 3 hours, burning, blocking German access while Americans strengthened their hold on the southern approach. The 36 hours of fighting for the Stavelot Bridge produced casualty figures that seemed disproportionate to the ground involved. 127 Americans killed or wounded, approximately 156 Germans killed, wounded, or captured, all for control of 60 meters of stone. The casualties reflected the battle's intensity and the tactical situation. Neither side could afford to lose the bridge, so both committed forces beyond what rational calculation would suggest. Every squad committed to attacking the bridge knew casualties would be heavy. Every defender knew German counterattacks would come. The bridge became personal in the way specific objectives sometimes do in war. Soldiers fought for it not because of abstract strategic importance, but because men had already died for it, and their deaths demanded that their sacrifice achieve something. The bridge war was both strategically critical and psychologically consuming, a battle within the battle that absorbed combat power far beyond its apparent importance. 11 o'clock in the morning, December 19th. Colonel Lovelady personally led a final assault to clear German forces from buildings on the north bank overlooking the bridge. Company B, 117th Infantry, advanced with tank destroyer support, using the burning Panther on the bridge as cover to reach the north bank. They cleared buildings room by room, using grenades and rifle fire, and occasionally flamethrowers when German defenders wouldn't surrender. By noon, Americans controlled both ends of the bridge and the immediate approaches. German forces withdrew to positions approximately 200 meters east of the bridge, still within artillery range, but unable to contest the bridge directly. The bridge war was over. Americans had won. The cost was 37 additional American casualties on December 19th alone, but the strategic result was decisive. Piper's supply route was definitively cut, and German relief forces would now have to fight through American positions to reach him. The bridge itself survived largely intact despite 36 hours of combat across and around it. Post-battle inspection revealed approximately 40 shell craters in the bridge deck, multiple impacts on the stone parapets, and scorching from the burned-out Panther, but the structure remained sound. The German demolition charges were discovered still in place on 3 piers, but unwired. The pioneer had never completed their work before being killed or driven off. Lieutenant Taylor's engineers removed the German charges carefully, adding them to American stocks. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Taylor had tried to blow the bridge to stop Germans and failed because his charges didn't detonate. Germans had tried to blow the bridge to stop Americans and failed because they couldn't complete the wiring. The bridge had survived both sides' attempts to destroy it, and now it would serve as the American supply route for operations to reduce Piper's trapped Kampfgruppe. Sometimes fate favors bridges over the armies that fight for them. The bridge war at Stavelot demonstrated urban warfare dynamics that would become familiar in later conflicts. Infrastructure becomes battlefield. Small units achieve disproportionate effects through proper positioning, casualties accumulate beyond proportion to ground gained, and psychological factors can dominate tactical ones. The bridge was worth fighting for because both sides believed it was worth fighting for, a circular logic that cost hundreds of casualties. But belief mattered more than logic. The Americans who fought for the bridge believed they were cutting off the most dangerous German penetration of the offensive. The Germans who died defending it believed they were keeping alive the possibility of victory. Both beliefs were largely accurate. The bridge war didn't win or lose the Battle of the Bulge, but it did win or lose the battle for Stavelot, which in turn determined Piper's fate, which in turn shaped the offensive's ultimate failure. Small hinges swing large doors. 60 meters of stone was a very small hinge. December 18, 1944. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Father Louis Honlet stood in the ruins of what had been the Lemaire family's home on the Rue Haute and tried to comprehend what he was witnessing. 8 Belgian men lay dead in the street, their bodies arranged in a rough line against a stone wall that was pockmarked with bullet holes. They had been executed, shot at close range, probably within the last hour, based on the blood still pooling on the cobblestones. Father Hanlet recognized every face. Marcel Dubois, the railway worker who had warned Captain Pryor about the fuel depot, Antoine Lemaire, a shopkeeper, Joseph Pierney, a teacher, 5 others whose names he'd known since childhood. SS troops stood nearby, smoking cigarettes and watching Father Hanlet with expressions that mixed boredom and warning. One soldier, an officer based on his insignia, approached Father Hanlet and explained in broken French that the men had been caught signaling to Americans. Saboteurs, partisans, traitors. The explanation was delivered without emotion, as if executing 8 civilians was a routine administrative task. Father Hanlet said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't get him killed too. The massacre of December 18th was the first of 3 separate civilian executions that would occur in Stavelot during the battle. And understanding why they happened requires understanding the psychology of SS units operating behind schedule and under pressure. Kampfgruppe Piper had been trained and indoctrinated to view civilians in combat zones as potential threats rather than innocents to be protected. This wasn't unique to the SS. All armies in all wars struggle with civilian-military interactions in combat zones, but SS units had particularly brutal records. The executions at Stavelot followed a pattern documented across Europe. Civilians were accused of resistance activity, sometimes with evidence and sometimes without, then shot in groups as collective punishment or deterrent. Whether the 8 men executed on December 18th actually signaled to Americans is unknown and probably unknowable. What's known is that SS troops believed they'd interfered with German operations, and belief was sufficient justification for execution. No trial, no formal charges, just bullets and bodies in a street. Madame Cécile Legaye experienced the battle from inside her home on the Rue de la Chapelle, and her experience was probably representative of hundreds of Stavelot civilians who survived by hiding and praying. Madame Legaye's house had a cellar, a vaulted stone room that dated to the 17th century and had weathered previous wars. On the morning of December 18th, as German artillery began falling, Madame Legaye gathered her family and neighbors, 47 people total, and led them into the cellar. They brought food, water, blankets, and candles, though the candles remained unlit because light seeping through cellar windows might attract attention. For the next 4 days, Madame Legaye's cellar became a world unto itself. 47 people in a space designed for storing wine, sharing 2 buckets for sanitation, rationing food by candlelight, listening to the battle above them. They could hear everything. Artillery shells whistling before impact, machine gun fire rattling in sustained bursts, tank treads grinding on cobblestones, men screaming in German and English and French. The sounds created mental images that were probably worse than reality, though reality was terrible enough. December 19th evening, an American artillery shell struck Madame Legaye's house, and the cellar became a tomb. The shell penetrated the roof and upper floors before exploding in the ground floor hallway. The blast was catastrophic. It collapsed the ground floor into the cellar below, bringing down tons of timber and stone. Madame Legaye was standing near the cellar stairs when the ceiling came down. She remembered a sound like thunder, then darkness and dust so thick she couldn't breathe. When the dust settled enough to see, she discovered that the center of the cellar had collapsed, crushing 13 people, including 5 children. The survivors, 34 people now, were trapped beneath rubble with no way to dig themselves out, and no certainty anyone knew they were there. They screamed for help until their voices gave out. They pounded on the cellar walls with tools and bare hands. Outside, the battle continued, indifferent to their suffering. For 18 hours, they waited in darkness, sharing the space with the bodies of neighbors and children they had known. Rescue came on December 20th, when American engineers, clearing rubble heard pounding from beneath a collapsed house, and excavated the cellar. Paul Renard was 16 years old in December 1944, young enough to be terrified and old enough to be useful. On December 20th, while Madame Legay and her neighbors were trapped underground, Renard was running messages through German lines for American intelligence. How a Belgian teenager became a courier for American forces involved equal parts accident and courage. Renard spoke some English, learned from an uncle who'd worked in London before the war, and had approached American soldiers after the counterattack with an offer to help. Someone decided a local who knew the town's layout could be valuable. They gave Renard a message, written in code he couldn't read, and told him to deliver it to American positions on the hills south of town. The route required crossing territory controlled by both sides, avoiding German patrols, and convincing American sentries not to shoot him as a suspected infiltrator. Renard made the journey in 40 minutes, running through alleys and gardens, once hiding in a chicken coop while German soldiers passed within meters. He delivered the message and was sent back with a reply. Over the next 3 days, Renard would make 7 courier runs, carrying intelligence about German positions, strength, and movements. He was terrified every time. He did it anyway. December 21st. German forces began retreating from Stavelot, pulling back to positions east of town as American reinforcements made their hold untenable. The retreat should have ended civilian casualties, but instead it triggered a final wave of executions. SS troops moving through eastern Stavelot rounded up 5 Belgian men, selected apparently at random from houses along the withdrawal route, and executed them in a field outside town. The victims included a farmer, 2 shop workers, and 2 men whose identities were never confirmed because their bodies were badly burned after being shot. Post-war investigations suggested the executions were ordered by SS junior officers, who feared the men might provide intelligence to pursuing Americans, though no evidence supported the suspicion. The 5 men were simply in the wrong place when paranoid soldiers decided eliminating potential witnesses was worth the bullets. Their bodies were discovered by American patrols on December 22nd, beginning the documentation that would eventually lead to war crimes charges. December 22nd. Belgian Red Cross workers entered Stavelot and began the grim work of documenting casualties. Dr. Henri Pearson led the effort, moving through ruined buildings with a team of volunteers to identify dead, treat wounded, and catalog destruction. Dr. Pearson's initial count: 93 buildings completely destroyed by fire or bombardment, approximately 200 structures damaged to varying degrees, and at least 130 civilian casualties, including 93 confirmed dead. The dead included the 13 killed in Madame Legay's cellar, the 18 executed by SS troops in 3 separate incidents, and 62 killed by artillery, small arms fire, or building collapses. Dr. Pearson's report, preserved in Belgian archives, reads with clinical precision that barely masks horror. House number 47, Rue Haute, entire Lemaire family, 7 persons, killed by artillery fire. House number 63, Place Saint-Remacle, Madame Gregoire, and 3 children, crushed when building collapsed. The list continues for pages. Each entry represents a life ended, a family destroyed, a community scarred. The Stavelot civilian experience reveals patterns that characterize the Battle of the Bulge more broadly. Civilians trapped between armies, suffering disproportionately because they couldn't evacuate and had no protection beyond stone walls and hope. Stavelot's civilian casualty rate, approximately 130, dead from a population of 7,000, represented nearly 2% of the town's population killed in 5 days. That's comparable to military casualty rates in major battles and extraordinary for a civilian population. The deaths resulted from 3 causes in roughly equal proportion: German executions, combat operations by both sides, and what historians delicately call collateral damage, the artillery shells and stray bullets and collapsing buildings that kill without intention or accountability. For the civilians of Stavelot, the distinction between intentional and unintentional death mattered little. Whether killed by SS executioners or American artillery, they were equally dead. Father Hanlett survived the battle and spent the rest of his life documenting what happened in Stavelot during those 5 days. His testimony appears in war crimes investigations, historical studies, and memorial publications. He described the executions he witnessed, the civilians he buried, and the moral complexity of a battle where both sides claimed to be liberators. Father Hanlett was careful not to equate American and German actions. He understood that Americans were liberating Belgium while Germans were occupying it, and that moral distinction mattered. But he also noted that liberation came at a cost paid primarily by civilians who'd committed no crime beyond living in a strategic location. His final testimony, given in 1956 for a Belgian historical commission, concluded with a question that remains uncomfortable. Who do you blame when civilians die in their own homes during a battle they didn't start and couldn't escape? The soldiers are following orders, the commanders are pursuing military objectives, and the civilians are simply dead. The question had no answer then. It has no answer now. The civilian experience at Stavelot complicates the clean narrative of liberation and heroism that typically characterizes accounts of the Battle of the Bulge. Americans fought bravely and ultimately prevailed. Engineers held when retreat seemed inevitable. Infantry counterattacked when defeat seemed certain. All of that is true and worthy of respect. But it's also true that the battle destroyed a town and killed more than 100 civilians who had no stake in military outcomes beyond wanting to survive. War contains these contradictions without resolving them. The engineers who defended Stavelot were heroes who saved thousands of lives by stopping Piper's advance. They were also participants in combat operations that killed Belgian children sheltering in cellars. Both facts coexist. Acknowledging both doesn't diminish the heroism. It recognizes the cost. Stavelot was won at a price paid partly by soldiers, but mostly by civilians who became statistics in after-action reports and names on memorial plaques that future generations would pass without reading. December 19, 1944. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper stood in the village square of L'Église, 8 kilometers west of Stavelot, and confronted the radio message that would determine his Kampfgruppe's fate. The message was terse and devastating. Stavelot Bridge lost to American counterattack, supply route cut, no resupply possible until situation restored. Piper read the message twice, as if repetition might change its content. His Kampfgruppe was trapped. Behind him, the road to Stavelot was blocked by American forces. Ahead, reconnaissance reported American reinforcements moving to cut off further advance. Piper's fuel situation was critical. Maybe 8 kilometers of travel remaining per vehicle, certainly not enough to reach the Meuse River, still 15 kilometers distant. His ammunition was sufficient for perhaps one more day of intense combat. He had 125 wounded German soldiers requiring medical treatment he couldn't provide. And he had 170 American prisoners of war whose presence complicated every decision. Piper had spent 4 years of war advancing. Now he was learning what happened when you couldn't advance anymore. L'Église in December 1944 was a farming village of perhaps 500 people, clustered around a church and a handful of stone buildings on a hillside overlooking the Amblève Valley. It had no strategic value beyond its location on Rolbon-D, Piper's assigned route to the Meuse. Piper's lead elements had reached L'Église on December 18th and consolidated there while waiting for fuel that never arrived. By December 19th, what should have been a temporary staging area had become a trap. American forces were closing from 3 directions: the 82nd Airborne Division approaching from the north, the 30th Infantry Division pushing from Stavelot to the east, and elements of the 3rd Armored Division moving to block western escape routes. Piper's Kampfgruppe, approximately 800 men and 60 vehicles, including tanks, was being encircled by forces that outnumbered it 5-1. The only questions were how long Piper could hold and what would happen when he couldn't. December 20th, dawn. First Lieutenant Virgil Larry flew reconnaissance over L'Église in a P-47 Thunderbolt and photographed what intelligence officers initially couldn't believe: An intact German armored formation clustered in a tiny Belgian village, apparently immobilized. Laurie's photographs showed 60-plus German vehicles, Panthers, King Tigers, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns, packed into L'Église narrow streets like cars in a parking lot. The vehicles appeared undamaged but stationary. Intelligence analysis concluded the Germans had run out of fuel, which meant the most powerful armored formation in the Ardennes Offensive was trapped and helpless. Laurie's photographs were distributed to division headquarters with annotations, identifying vehicle types and estimating total German strength. Within hours, American artillery began receiving fire missions targeting the coordinates Laurie had photographed. The pocket was being prepared for destruction. Piper spent December 20th and 21st conducting the defensive operations he'd spent 4 years avoiding, holding ground rather than taking it, conserving resources rather than expending them, waiting for relief rather than creating breakthroughs. His defense of L'Église was professionally competent. He positioned his immobilized tanks as stationary artillery, used buildings as strong points, and organized his 800 men into a perimeter that maximized fields of fire while minimizing exposed positions. But competent defense couldn't solve his fundamental problems: no fuel, diminishing ammunition, increasing casualties, and no prospect of relief. German High Command was launching desperate attacks to reopen the Stavelot corridor, but those attacks were failing against American defenders who'd learned their jobs. Piper radioed situation reports that grew progressively more dire. December 20th, situation serious but holding. December 21st, ammunition critical, casualties mounting, request immediate relief. December 22nd, relief essential within 24 hours or Kampfgruppe lost. The American prisoners in Piper's custody created a moral and practical dilemma that Piper handled with uncharacteristic restraint. The 170 American POW, mostly from units overrun during the offensive's first days, were housed in L'Église's church under guard. Piper could have executed them, as his units had executed prisoners at Malmedy and elsewhere. The prisoners consumed food and water Piper's own men needed. They required guards who could have been manning defensive positions. They witnessed German dispositions and strength, making them intelligence liabilities. Every military calculation suggested eliminating them. Piper didn't. Post-war testimony from the American prisoners consistently reported that they were treated correctly, not well, but according to Geneva Convention standards. They were given food equal to what German soldiers received. They were not abused or threatened. When American artillery began hitting L'Église, they were sheltered in the church cellar alongside German wounded. Why Piper protected prisoners at L'Église after ordering their execution at Malmedy remains debated. Perhaps he recognized that these prisoners would testify at his eventual trial. Perhaps the tactical situation was different. Perhaps Piper himself was inconsistent, capable of both brutality and restraint depending on circumstances. Wars don't clarify moral character, they reveal its complexity. December 22nd, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. American artillery began a systematic bombardment of L'Église that would continue for the next 48 hours. The BAO, 82nd Airborne Division's Artillery Battalion, plus corps-level artillery assets, approximately 60 guns total, fired on coordinates that covered L'Église's entire perimeter. The bombardment wasn't designed to destroy German tanks. Artillery couldn't penetrate tank armor, but to suppress German infantry, destroy buildings that provided cover, and make holding L'Église psychologically unbearable. Shells fell every few minutes, impacting randomly across the village. German casualties accumulated. 5 killed December 22nd, 12 killed December 23rd. Buildings collapsed. The church tower, used as an observation post, was hit and partially destroyed. Piper moved his command post 3 times as buildings were demolished around him. By December 23rd evening, L'Église had been transformed from a village into a moonscape of rubble and craters where survival depended on staying underground. Piper's final relief attempt came on December 21st when German forces launched their third attack to reopen the Stavelot corridor. This attack involved elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, approximately 22 tanks and 500 infantry, assaulting American positions in eastern Stavelot with orders to break through to L'Église, regardless of cost. The attack failed catastrophically. American defenders, now reinforced and entrenched, had prepared positions specifically to repel armor attacks. M10 tank destroyers engaged German tanks at ranges where American guns penetrated, while German return fire struggled to locate camouflage positions. The attack lasted 4 hours and cost the Germans 6 tanks destroyed, approximately 127 casualties, and 0 ground gained. After December 21st, no further relief attempts were launched. Piper was on his own. December 23rd, midnight, Piper gathered his officers and announced his decision: abandon all vehicles and equipment, escape on foot through American lines, leave American prisoners with medical supplies and directions to American positions. The decision was militarily rational. Staying meant eventual destruction or surrender, and Piper still believed escape was possible. But announcing the decision to soldiers who'd fought for 4 years in those tanks, who'd maintained those vehicles through mud and winter and combat, who'd believed their armor made them invincible, was announcing the death of the Kampfgruppe. The tanks would be abandoned. The vehicles would be destroyed or left for Americans to capture. Everything they'd fought for, the rapid advance, the breakthrough to the Meuse, the possibility of victory, would be left behind in a Belgian village nobody had heard of until this week. Officers received their orders with stunned silence. Some protested. Couldn't they break out with vehicles? Couldn't they fight through? Couldn't something be done? Piper's response was documented by multiple witnesses. The something that could be done should have been done at Stavelot 4 days ago. Now we walk or we die. The escape plan was simple in concept and desperate in execution. Move in small groups during darkness, navigate cross-country to avoid roads, reach German lines approximately 8 kilometers east. Piper organized his 800 men into groups of 50, staggering their departures to avoid detection. Each group carried weapons, minimal ammunition, and wounded who could walk. Wounded who couldn't walk would be left with American prisoners and German medics. At 2 o'clock in the morning, on December 24th, the first group departed La Glaise, moving east through snow and darkness toward uncertain salvation. Piper traveled with the third group, refusing to leave before his men. Behind them, 60 tanks and vehicles sat silent in La Glaise's ruins, billions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment. The offensive's most powerful armored force, abandoned because fuel mattered more than firepower. December 24th, 9 o'clock in the morning. American patrols from the 82nd Airborne entered La Glaise, expecting to find desperate Germans defending a final perimeter. Instead, they found 170 American prisoners in the church, approximately 30 German wounded under medical care, and 60 intact German vehicles sitting empty in the streets. The prisoners explained, Germans left during the night, heading east. The American patrol commander radioed the astonishing news. The entire Kampfgruppe had escaped, apparently without being detected. Intelligence officers couldn't believe it. How did 800 men slip through an encirclement held by 3 divisions? The answer involved darkness, German tactical proficiency, and American dispositions focused on preventing vehicles from escaping rather than infantry. Small groups moving cross-country at night through terrain, Americans weren't patrolling. Piper's escape was simultaneously humiliating for American forces and testament to German tactical skill. Of 800 men who attempted escape, approximately 342 reached German lines, including Piper himself. The rest were killed, captured, or died in the attempt. The Kampfgruppe had achieved a 43% survival rate. The offensive it had spearheaded had achieved nothing. December 18th, 1944. 10 o'clock in the morning. Captain John T. Pryor stood in the Stavelot fuel depot watching German Panther tanks appear on a ridgeline 1,200 meters distant and wondered if he'd waited too long to evacuate. The tanks were clearly visible, dark silhouettes against winter sky, turrets traversing as commanders surveyed the terrain. Pryor could see the depot from where the German tanks sat, row after row of fuel containers, thousands of jerry cans and drums arranged in geometric patterns that screamed strategic target to anyone with eyes. The Panthers sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, observers in their turrets studying the depot through binoculars. Then, inexplicably, they moved on. The tanks turned north and disappeared towards Stavelot town center. Pryor exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The fuel depot, 2.5 million gallons, the largest concentration of gasoline in Belgium, had just been bypassed by the German force that most desperately needed it. Understanding why Piper's Kampfgruppe failed to seize the fuel depot requires understanding the chaos of mobile warfare and the limitations of tactical intelligence. Piper knew fuel depots existed in the Stavelot area. German intelligence had identified general locations based on aerial reconnaissance and agent reports. But German intelligence assessments estimated the depot contained approximately 50,000 gallons, a useful amount, but not strategically significant enough to divert from the main objective. The actual figure was 50 times higher, but nobody on the German side knew that. Piper's immediate priority on December 18th morning was securing Stavelot Bridge and pushing west, not conducting detailed reconnaissance of surrounding terrain. His lead tanks observed the fuel depot, reported its existence, and continued toward what they believed was the more important objective, the bridge. By the time Piper realized the depot's true scale, his supply line had been cut, and he was in no position to return and capture it. The closest German approach to the fuel depot occurred at approximately 10:30 on December 18th, when a Panther commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Werner Sternebeck sat on high ground overlooking the depot at a range of 1,000 meters. Sternebeck's post-war interrogation, conducted by American intelligence officers in 1946, provides the German perspective. Sternebeck saw the depot clearly: thousands of containers, American trucks moving in and out, minimal security. He radioed Piper requesting permission to detach his platoon to seize the depot. Piper's response was immediate and negative. Maintain formation, continue toward primary objective, don't deviate from mission. Sternebeck protested that the depot appeared to contain significant fuel stores. Piper replied that securing Stavelot and pushing west took priority over investigating every supply dump they passed. Sternebeck followed orders. His Panther rolled away from the ridgeline towards Stavelot. The opportunity, if it existed, passed. The depot remained in American hands by default rather than by design. Staff Sergeant William Hunsicker watched German tanks on the ridgeline from his position in the depot and prepared for an attack that never came. Hunsicker commanded the 12-man security detachment, and his plan for defending against armor was essentially non-existent because defending against armor with rifles was impossible. When the Panthers appeared, Hunsicker ordered his men to take cover and prepare to withdraw. The standing orders were clear. If German forces attacked the depot, security personnel were to evacuate immediately. The fuel was expendable. Trained soldiers were not. Hunsicker watched the Panthers through binoculars, counting vehicles, 5 tanks visible, and calculating how long his detachment could delay if ordered to fight. The calculation was depressing. Maybe 5 minutes of rifle fire before being overrun. Then the Panthers turned away. Hunsicker couldn't understand it. The depot was right there, clearly visible, lightly defended. Why weren't Germans attacking? The answer, that German commanders didn't recognize the depot's value, wouldn't become clear until post-war historical analysis revealed the intelligence failure. Captain Pryor received evacuation orders at 3 o'clock on December 18th afternoon, approximately 5 hours after German tanks had bypassed the depot. The orders came from 1st Army headquarters and reflected belated recognition that the depot was vulnerable: begin emergency fuel dispersal, destroy what cannot be evacuated, prepare to abandon site if German forces return. Pryor's staff began frantically loading trucks with jerry cans, driving them west towards safer rear areas. But moving 2.5 million gallons of fuel wasn't a task measured in hours. It was a task measured in days or weeks. Pryor's trucks made repeated runs throughout December 18th and 19th, evacuating perhaps 40,000 gallons, less than 2% of the total. The rest sat in the depot, waiting for destruction orders that never came because American commanders couldn't decide whether the depot was more valuable intact or destroyed. The indecision reflected competing priorities. Destroying the fuel would deny it to Germans, but also eliminate a resource Americans might need for counterattacks. December 19th, 1st Army investigation officers arrived at the depot to understand how 2.5 million gallons of fuel had nearly fallen into German hands and why nobody had destroyed it when capture seemed imminent. The investigation revealed cascading failures in planning and communication. First, the depot had been established without adequate security because nobody anticipated German forces penetrating that far west. Second, no demolition charges had been pre-positioned to destroy fuel in an emergency. Third, evacuation plans existed on paper but had never been rehearsed. Fourth, The chain of command for ordering destruction was unclear. Pryor didn't have authority to destroy the fuel on his own initiative, but higher headquarters couldn't make the decision quickly enough to matter. The investigation's conclusion was bureaucratic and damning. The fuel depot at Stavelot survived due to enemy failure to recognize its value rather than friendly actions to defend it. In other words, Americans got lucky because Germans made mistakes. The strategic consequences of preserving the fuel depot extended far beyond the Stavelot battle. The 2.4 million gallons that remained intact after the battle directly supplied American counteroffensive operations in January 1945. When American armored divisions launched attacks to reduce the Bulge salient and push German forces back across their starting lines, they ran on fuel drawn partly from the Stavelot depot. The fuel that might have powered Piper's drive to the Meuse instead powered American operations that reversed his offensive. There's a poetic justice in that outcome, though the justice was accidental rather than planned. Wars often turn on accidents, the message that arrives too late, the commander who makes the wrong decision, the intelligence estimate that's wildly inaccurate. The Stavelot fuel depot was all of those things. An accident waiting to happen that somehow didn't happen, a disaster that transformed into opportunity through equal parts. Luck and enemy incompetence. Post-war analysis by both American and German historians consistently identifies the fuel depot as one of the great what-ifs of the Ardennes Offensive. If Piper had captured the depot intact on December 18th, his Kampfgruppe could have refueled completely, enough to reach the Meuse and support follow-on operations for days. The offensive might not have succeeded. American reinforcements were arriving regardless of fuel, but it would have extended the campaign and significantly increased casualties. German generals in post-war interrogations cited fuel shortages as the primary factor limiting the offensive's success. Sepp Dietrich, 6th Panzer Army commander, testified that, with adequate fuel, we could have reached the Meuse. Whether reaching the Meuse would have meant winning the war is doubtful, but it would have meant a longer, bloodier campaign. The fuel depot that survived determined that campaign's duration more than any single battle. Captain Pryor's final inventory on December 20th tallied 2,460,000 gallons remaining, minus the 40,000 evacuated equals 2,420,000 gallons still in place. The depot continued operations through late December and into January, supplying forward units with the fuel they needed to maintain pressure on retreating German forces. Pryor never received commendation for preserving the depot because preservation wasn't the result of his actions. It was the result of German failures. But Pryor's staff continued their unglamorous work of managing logistics and distribution, understanding that wars are won by bullets and fuel and replacement parts delivered to the right places at the right times. The engineers at Stavelot got medals and recognition for holding the bridge. Pryor's logistics troops got paperwork and orders for the next day's fuel distribution. Both contributions mattered. History remembers the dramatic battles and forgets the unseized fuel depots that might have changed everything. The fuel depot story reveals a fundamental military principle. What doesn't happen can matter as much as what does happen. The battle for Stavelot Bridge was dramatic and bloody and historically significant. The non-battle for the fuel depot was invisible and bloodless and equally significant. Both outcomes shaped the campaign. The bridge battle gets chapters in histories because it involved heroism and sacrifice and clear cause and effect. The depot non-battle gets footnotes because nothing dramatic happened. But from a strategic perspective, preserving 2.5 million gallons mattered at least as much as holding a bridge. Wars are fought by soldiers and decided by supply officers. Stavelot demonstrated both truths simultaneously. December 20th, 1944, 5 o'clock in the morning. Staff Sergeant Robert Billington crouched in a foxhole on Stavelot's eastern edge and watched the tree line 400 meters distant, waiting for the attack he knew was coming. Billington commanded a squad from Company B, 117th Infantry, and he had been in this same foxhole for 36 hours with minimal sleep, eating cold rations and trying to stay warm in temperatures that hovered near freezing. His squad's mission was simple and terrifying: hold the eastern approaches to Stavelot against German attempts to reopen the corridor to Piper. Intelligence reports, delivered by a runner around 3 in the morning, warned that German armor was massing east of Stavelot. Elements of the 2nd S Panzer Division, approximately 22 tanks and 500 infantry, preparing to attack at dawn. Billington's squad had rifles, 2 bazookas with 6 rockets, and a 30 caliber machine gun. They were supposed to stop 22 tanks. The mathematics didn't work. The German attack on December 20th represented a last desperate attempt to rescue Piper's trapped Kampfgruppe by brute force. German High Command understood that Piper's force at La Glaise was strategically meaningless if it remained isolated. It couldn't advance, couldn't influence the battle, and would eventually be destroyed or forced to surrender. Reopening the corridor through Stavelot was essential, not just to save Piper, but to maintain any hope that the offensive could still achieve something. The 2nd S Panzer Division received orders to attack regardless of cost. Break through American defenses at Stavelot, secure the bridge, establish a supply route to La Glaise. The division commander protested that attacking into prepared defenses against an enemy holding urban terrain was nearly suicidal. He was told to attack anyway. Orders from Hitler himself specified that Piper must be relieved. So, 22 tanks and 500 men prepared to assault positions held by approximately 1,400 American infantry, supported by tank destroyers and artillery. 5:30 in the morning, December 20th. Billington saw them coming. A wall of German infantry emerging from the tree line, moving in extended line formation across open ground towards Stavelot. Behind the infantry, Panthers appeared, massive silhouettes grinding forward at walking pace, turrets traversing to acquire targets. The attacking force looked unstoppable, hundreds of soldiers, dozens of tanks, advancing with the kind of professional coordination that characterized German attacks throughout the war. Billington's squad waited. American doctrine emphasized holding fire until enemies were within effective range, which for M1 Garands meant roughly 300 meters for aimed fire. At 400 meters, Billington could see individual German soldiers but couldn't reliably hit them. At 300 meters, he could see their faces. At 250 meters, Billington opened fire, and his squad followed. The sound was overwhelming, 8 M1s firing as fast as Zar. Soldiers could pull triggers, brass casings ejecting, clips pinging out when 8 rounds were expended. German soldiers started falling, but the line kept coming. The American defensive plan at Stavelot's eastern edge reflected lessons learned from 3 days of combat. Use terrain to channel attackers into kill zones, position anti-tank weapons in depth with overlapping fields of fire, and maintain reserves for counterattacking penetrations. American infantry occupied buildings and foxholes in a defensive belt approximately 400 meters deep. M10 tank destroyers from the 825th Tank Destroyer Battalion were positioned in hull-down positions on high ground, only their turrets visible, giving them protected positions from which to engage German armor. American artillery, Corps-level batteries positioned west of Stavelot, was registered on likely German approach routes. The defense was layered and professional, but its success depended on soldiers like Billington holding their ground when tanks rolled toward them. 7:30 in the morning, the 1st Panther reached the edge of Stavelot and was immediately engaged by multiple American anti-tank weapons. A bazooka round struck its left tread, immobilizing the tank. The crew attempted to reverse, but succeeded only in throwing the damaged tread completely. An M10 tank destroyer fired from 700 meters, its 3-inch armor-piercing round penetrating the Panther's side armor. The tank exploded, ammunition detonating in a secondary blast that blew the turret off. 2 more Panthers attempted to suppress the M10 position with main gunfire, but the M10 reversed behind its protective ridge before they could range accurately. A 3rd Panther was hit by another bazooka team and caught fire. Within 12 minutes of reaching Stavelot's edge, German armor had lost 3 tanks, and the attack's momentum was stalling. Panthers were individually superior to American tank destroyers, but positioning and preparation were equalizing the technical advantage. German tanks were attacking into positions Americans had spent 3 days fortifying. That advantage mattered more than armor thickness. Sergeant Billington's position was nearly overrun around 8 o'clock when German infantry infiltrated through a gap in American lines and attacked his foxhole from the flank. Billington didn't see them coming. His attention was focused forward on the main German advance. The first indication of flanking troops was a German grenade landing 3 meters from his foxhole. The grenade detonated, and shrapnel tore through Billington's left shoulder. He fell, momentarily stunned. German soldiers appeared above the foxhole, 2 men with MP40 machine pistols. Billington's squadmate, Private Kenneth Moore, shot both Germans with his M1 at a range of perhaps 5 meters. More Germans were coming. More grabbed Billington's and dragged him out of the foxhole, pulling him back 30 meters to a secondary position while firing his Garand one-handed. They reached cover just as German soldiers occupied the abandoned foxhole. The position was lost, but the line held because American platoon sergeants had planned for exactly this situation. Primary positions that could be abandoned without collapsing the entire defense. December 20th, 10 o'clock in the morning. The German attack culminated and failed. 3.5 hours of sustained assault had cost 2nd SS Panzer Division 6 tanks destroyed, 12 more damaged, and approximately 127 casualties. They had penetrated perhaps 200 meters into Stavelot's eastern suburbs before being stopped by concentrated American fire. American casualties were 32 killed or wounded, including Sergeant Billington, whose shoulder wound would evacuate him from combat. The casualty exchange ratio, roughly 4 German casualties for every American casualty, reflected the advantages of prepared defense in urban terrain. More importantly, the attack had failed to achieve its objective. The corridor to Piper remained closed. German commanders requested permission to renew the attack with reinforcements. Permission was denied. The division couldn't afford to bleed itself dry attacking Stavelot when other sectors of the offensive were collapsing simultaneously. December 21st, 4 o'clock in the morning. Germans launched a second attack, this time at night with different tactics. Instead of massed armor and infantry in daylight, the 21st's attack used infiltration tactics. Small groups of SS infantry with flamethrowers and demolition charges, targeting specific American strongpoints in darkness. The attack was more effective than daylight assault. German teams reached American positions before being detected, used flamethrowers to clear buildings, and created penetrations in the defensive line. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in 3 separate locations as Germans and Americans struggled for control of individual buildings. Private Thomas Henderson found himself fighting with his entrenching tool when his rifle jammed, swinging the shovel like an axe at a German soldier who'd entered the same room. Both men wounded each other before Henderson's squad mates intervened. The night battle lasted 5 hours and was more brutal than the daylight attack, but the result was the same. German penetrations were contained and eliminated by American counterattacks. By 9 o'clock in the morning, on December 21st, Germans had withdrawn, leaving behind another 57 casualties and 0 ground gained. December 22nd saw a third and final German attack, smaller than previous efforts, more an aggressive reconnaissance than a genuine assault. 2 Panther tanks and perhaps 100 infantry probed American positions on Stavelot's eastern approaches, engaged in desultory exchanges of fire, and withdrew after an hour. The attack inflicted 9 American casualties and cost Germans an estimated 20 casualties and 1 tank damaged. More significantly, it demonstrated that German forces east of Stavelot had abandoned serious attempts to break through. The corridor was closed. Piper was on his own. The Eastern Gate had held through 3 major attacks and countless smaller actions. The 117th Infantry Regiment's defensive success at Stavelot would earn them a Presidential Unit citation, but the citation wouldn't capture the individual moments of terror and courage that characterized the defense. Soldiers like Billington holding foxholes, like Moore rescuing wounded squad mates, like Henderson fighting with entrenching tools when weapons failed. The Eastern Gate defense at Stavelot illuminates why German offensive operations in late war failed despite tactical advantages. German units retained excellent training, good equipment, and experienced leadership. What they lacked was the numerical superiority and material advantage necessary to overcome prepared defenses. American forces at Stavelot in December weren't the same army that had retreated in confusion in December 1944's first days. They'd learned urban combat, integrated anti-tank weapons effectively, and developed the kind of tactical confidence that comes from winning fights. The Germans attacking Stavelot were still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. The attacks failed not because German troops were incompetent, but because American troops had become competent. Wars turn on that transition. The moment defending forces stop fearing attackers and start killing them efficiently. For the Americans at Stavelot, that transition happened somewhere between December 17th's panicked initial defense and December 20th's professional repulsive armor attacks. The engineers who held the bridge had bought time for infantry to arrive. The infantry who held the Eastern Gate had bought time for the offensive to collapse elsewhere. Both purchases mattered. Both required soldiers willing to die in foxholes for objectives they barely understood but defended anyway because defense was their mission. December 23, 1944. 11 o'clock at night. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper assembled his officers in a cellar beneath L'Églyse's ruined church and announced the decision that would save some lives while abandoning everything else. They would escape on foot. The cellar was dark except for a single kerosene lamp that cast shadows across faces that hadn't slept properly in days. Piper's voice was steady, but the words were devastating. All vehicles would be abandoned. The Panthers, the King Tigers, the half-tracks. Everything that had made Kampfgruppe Peiper the spearhead of the offensive. All heavy weapons would be destroyed. The artillery pieces, the anti-aircraft guns, the equipment they'd fought to protect. Wounded who could walk would come. Wounded who couldn't walk would stay behind with medics and American prisoners. They would move in small groups through American lines during darkness, navigating cross-country, to German positions approximately 8 kilometers east. Peiper's operations officer asked the obvious question: what about the prisoners? Peiper's response was documented by multiple witnesses. Leave them alive with medical supplies. We're not adding to the charges that will be filed against us. The decision to spare American prisoners at L'Église stands in stark moral contrast to the Malmedy massacre just 6 days earlier, and understanding why Peiper made different choices requires grappling with motivations that were probably mixed and contradictory. The practical calculation was clear. Executing 170 prisoners would take time, make noise, and potentially alert American forces to the escape attempt. The prisoners were housed in the church with German wounded, and killing them meant killing witnesses who included German medics. But practical calculations alone don't explain Peiper's choice, because Malmedy had similar practical considerations, and Peiper's units had murdered prisoners anyway. Perhaps Peiper recognized that L'Église prisoners would testify at his war crimes trial, and treating them correctly might generate sympathy. Perhaps the tactical situation was different enough that execution seemed unnecessary. Perhaps Peiper was simply inconsistent, a man capable of both atrocity and restraint, depending on circumstances that even he couldn't fully explain. Wars don't clarify character. They reveal its complexity in ways that resist simple narratives. Major Hal McCown was the senior American prisoner at L'Église, and his testimony provides the American perspective on Peiper's final hours in the pocket. McCown had been captured on December 21st when his battalion command post was overrun. He'd spent 2 days in the church cellar watching German. Defenses deteriorate under American artillery fire. On the night of December 23rd, German guards informed American prisoners that SS troops were evacuating, and that prisoners would be left behind with medical supplies and directions to American lines. McCown couldn't believe it. Throughout the war, German treatment of American prisoners had been inconsistent at best and murderous at worst. He expected execution, or at minimum being taken as hostages during the escape. Instead, German medics inventoried medical supplies, showed American prisoners where food and water were stored, and explained which direction would reach American positions fastest. Around midnight, McCown heard German troops assembling outside the church. Low voices, equipment being adjusted, the sounds of an army preparing to move. Then silence. The Germans had vanished into the snow. December 24th, 2 o'clock in the morning. Peiper led his group, approximately 50 men including his headquarters, staff, east from L'Église, along a route that avoided roads and followed ridgelines where snow cover and darkness provided concealment. They moved in single file, maintaining intervals of 5 meters between soldiers, weapons at ready, speaking in whispers if at all. The temperature was well below freezing, and snow was falling, conditions that made movement miserable but provided excellent cover. Peiper navigated using a compass and a map he'd memorized, leading his group across frozen fields and through forests where bare trees offered minimal concealment. Behind them, 750 more German soldiers were following in groups of 30 to 50, each group separated by 15-minute intervals to avoid detection. The escape plan assumed American encirclement was porous, that small groups moving at night through terrain Americans weren't actively patrolling could slip through gaps in the line. The assumption would prove partly correct and partly catastrophic. The first, German group to be detected and destroyed was caught around 3:30 in the morning by American sentries from the 82nd Airborne Division. The group, approximately 40 men from Peiper's 3rd Company, was moving along a stream bed when they stumbled into an American listening post. The resulting firefight was brief and one-sided. American machine guns opened fire at a range of 50 meters, cutting down Germans who couldn't see their attackers in the darkness. 23 Germans were killed in perhaps 90 seconds of firing. The survivors attempted to scatter, but were pursued by American patrols that had been alerted by the gunfire. By dawn, the entire 40-man group had been killed or captured. Their destruction alerted American forces that Germans were attempting to escape, but the alert came too late to close the gaps through which most German groups had already passed. Piper's group encountered American positions around 4 o'clock in the morning, but avoided detection through a combination of luck and professional fieldcraft. They heard American voices, soldiers talking in a foxhole, perhaps 200 meters distant. Piper hand-signaled his men to freeze. For perhaps 10 minutes, 50 German soldiers stood motionless in snow, while American sentries talked and laughed, completely unaware that an SS officer and his headquarters staff were within grenade-throwing distance. Then the American voices faded as sentries moved to different positions. Piper's group waited another 5 minutes before continuing. They crossed what was apparently the American perimeter and moved into undefended terrain beyond. The escape was working, but Piper had no way of knowing how many other groups were successfully escaping or being destroyed in the attempt. Dawn on December 24th revealed the scale of the German escape to American commanders who'd been confident the entire Kampfgruppe was trapped and awaiting surrender. Patrols from the 82nd Airborne Division entered La Glace at first light and discovered the town abandoned, except for prisoners and wounded. Captain Charles P. Rowland led the first patrol into the church and found Major McCown and 169 other American prisoners sheltering in the cellar. McCown briefed Rowland on what had happened. Germans had left during the night in small groups heading east. All vehicles and heavy weapons abandoned. Approximately 800 men attempting escape. Rowland radioed the information to division headquarters and received orders to pursue. But pursuing 800 men who'd scattered into small groups across 10 square kilometers of wooded terrain in winter was effectively impossible. American units found tracks in the snow, occasionally encountered stragglers who surrendered, but the main German groups had vanished. December 25th, morning. Piper reached German lines near Wanne, approximately 10 kilometers east of La Glace. His group had been moving for 27 hours with minimal rest, navigating through American positions and across terrain that would have been difficult even in daylight. Piper counted his survivors. 43 of the 50 who had started with him had made it. 7 were missing, presumed captured or killed. The reunions at German lines were muted because nobody knew yet how many of the Kampfgruppe had survived. Over the next 12 hours, more groups straggled in, squads of 10 or 15 men, exhausted and frozen, but alive. By December 26th, the accounting was complete. 342 men had reached German lines from the original 800 who had attempted escape. The survival rate was 43%. The failure rate, dead, captured, or missing, was 57%. Piper's Kampfgruppe had effectively ceased to exist. The equipment left behind at La Glace represented the single largest intact capture of German armor on the Western Front: 28 Panther tanks, 6 King Tiger tanks, 25 Panzer IV tanks, plus dozens of half-tracks, self-propelled guns, and support vehicles. American recovery teams spent weeks cataloging and removing the equipment. Some vehicles were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground in the United States for technical analysis. Others were scrapped for parts. A few were restored to running condition and tested by American crews who wanted to understand how German armor compared to American tanks. The conclusion was that German tanks were individually superior in armor and firepower, but mechanically unreliable and logistically complex. Panthers broke down frequently and required specialized parts. King Tigers consumed fuel at rates that made them impractical for sustained operations. American Shermans were inferior in direct combat, but vastly superior in reliability and ease of maintenance. The abandoned German equipment at La Glace became an intelligence windfall that informed American tank design for years afterward. The escape from La Glace generated contradictory assessments from both sides. American commanders viewed it as an embarrassing failure of the encirclement. How had 800 men escaped through lines held by 3 divisions? The post-battle investigation revealed that American dispositions focused on preventing vehicle breakouts, not infantry infiltration. Tank destroyers and blocking positions covered roads, but gaps existed in wooded terrain that small groups could exploit. German commanders viewed the escape with mixed feelings. Piper had saved 43% of his force, which was better than total destruction, but he had lost all equipment and achieved none of his objectives. The Kampfgruppe that was supposed to reach the Meuse River had instead abandoned 60 tanks in a Belgian village after advancing 40 kilometers. The escape was tactically impressive but strategically irrelevant. Major McCown was liberated on December 24th and provided detailed testimony about his captivity that would later be used in Piper's war crimes trial. McCown's testimony was remarkably balanced. He confirmed that prisoners at L'Église had been treated correctly under Geneva Convention standards, that Piper had explicitly ordered prisoners protected during artillery bombardments, and that German medics had shared scarce medical supplies with wounded Americans. But McCown also testified about conversations with Piper during which Piper acknowledged the Malmedy massacre and offered explanations that McCown found unconvincing. The testimony painted Piper as capable of both restraint and brutality, a war criminal who sometimes followed the rules of war and sometimes violated them catastrophically. The complexity mattered for post-war legal proceedings that struggled to assign guilt and punishment to men whose actions defied simple categorization. The snow continued falling on December 25th as American soldiers occupied L'Église, and German survivors reached their lines. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, but Piper's offensive, the most dangerous German penetration, the spearhead that was supposed to reach the Meuse, had ended not with dramatic final battle, but with exhausted men walking through snow, abandoning their tanks, escaping with their lives, and little else. Wars contain these anticlimactic moments more often than heroic last stands. Piper had driven farther west than any other German commander in the offensive. He'd come within 15 kilometers of the Meuse River, and he had ultimately achieved nothing except casualties and abandoned equipment and a trial that would convict him of war crimes. The escape in the snow was the end of his offensive and the beginning of his accounting for what that offensive had cost. December 26, 1944. 10 o'clock in the morning. Madame Renée Grégoire stood in what had been her house on the Rue Haute and tried to find something, anything, worth salvaging from the rubble. The house where she'd lived for 32 years, where she'd raised 3 children, where every room held memories, had been reduced to a pile of stones and splintered timber. An American artillery shell had struck the roof on December 19th, and the resulting fire had consumed everything the collapse hadn't destroyed. Madame Grégoire picked through the ruins with hands that were cut and bleeding from moving stones. She found a twisted silver fork that had been her grandmother's. She found fragments of a dinner plate. She found nothing else worth keeping. Around her, other Stavelot residents were conducting similar archaeological expeditions through their own destroyed lives, searching rubble for remnants of existence before the battle. Some found treasures, a photograph that had survived, a piece of jewelry hidden in a cellar. Most have found only ash and broken stone. The town they'd known was gone, American graves. Registration officers arrived in Stavelot on December 27th and began the grim work of recovering and identifying bodies. The recovery operations followed established procedures. Teams searched buildings, streets, and surrounding terrain for remains, photographed positions where bodies were found, collected identification tags and personal effects, and attempted to determine whether the deceased were American, German, or civilian. First Lieutenant Robert Perkins led a graves registration team and kept detailed logs that survive in National Archives records. December 27th entry. Stavelot Town Center recovered 14 American remains from destroyed buildings. Identification difficult due to fire damage. Personal effects collected include 7 dog tags, 3 wallets, miscellaneous uniform items. December 28th entry. Stavelot Eastern approaches, recovered 23 German remains from defensive positions. Multiple casualties appear to have frozen to death after being wounded. The logs read with clinical precision that barely masked the horror of working with bodies that had been exposed to winter weather, fire, and decomposition for over a week. The frozen dead presented particular challenges for identification and recovery. Bodies that had lain in snow for days became rigid and difficult to move without damage. Facial features were often unrecognizable due to wounds or exposure. Dog tags, the primary method of American identification, had sometimes been lost during combat or removed by comrades attempting field recovery. German dead frequently carried no identification at all, or carried papers that had been destroyed by weather or blood. Lieutenant Perkins's teams developed techniques through trial and error, used stretchers to move frozen bodies without breaking limbs, photographed distinctive uniform items or wounds that might aid identification, separate personal effects carefully so they could be matched to specific remains. The work was physically exhausting and psychologically devastating. Several Graves registration soldiers requested transfer after working in Stavelot. Their requests were denied because the work had to be done and trained personnel were scarce. Father Louis Hanley conducted the first Mass in Stavelot's damaged church on December 28th, and his sermon addressed grief that words couldn't adequately express. The church's roof had been partially destroyed by artillery fire, and services were conducted in a sanctuary open to winter sky. Approximately 200 people attended, a fraction of Stavelot's pre-war population, but representing everyone who had returned so far. Father Hanlett read the names of 37 parishioners killed during the battle: Marcel Dubois, Antoine Lemaire, Joseph Pierney, Madame Cécile Legaye, and 33 others. He read slowly, pausing after each name to allow the weight of loss to register. Some families had lost multiple members. The Lemaire family lost 7 people when their house was hit by artillery. The Pierney family lost 4. Father Hanlett's sermon avoided politics and blame, focusing instead on shared suffering and the necessity of rebuilding. "We cannot change what happened," he said. "We can only choose how we respond to what happened. We can choose bitterness, or we can choose rebuilding. We can choose to remain broken, or we can choose to heal." The words were inadequate but necessary. Wars destroy communities. What comes after requires communities to rebuild themselves. January 3rd, 1945. American combat engineers from the 1111th Engineer Combat Group surveyed Stavelot's damage for reconstruction planning. Their report documented destruction with engineering precision: 93 buildings totally destroyed, defined as requiring complete demolition and reconstruction; 212 buildings damaged, defined as requiring major repairs to roofs, walls, or structural elements; 17 buildings undamaged. The Stavelot Bridge had sustained approximately 40 shell impacts, but remained structurally sound and trafficable. The town's water system was destroyed at 12 separate points, requiring extensive repairs. The electrical system was completely non-functional and would require rebuilding from substations forward. Roads were cratered by artillery and blocked by rubble. The engineering estimate for returning Stavelot to habitable condition: minimum 6 months with dedicated labor and materials. The estimate for full reconstruction: 3 to 5 years. Stavelot had been fought over for 5 days. It would take years to recover. The casualty accounting for the Battle of Stavelot took weeks to compile as units submitted after-action reports and Graves registration teams completed recovery operations. First Army compiled the final American casualty figures in late January 1945. 241 American soldiers killed, 541 wounded, approximately 100 captured, most later freed when German positions were overrun. The casualties weren't distributed evenly. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion suffered 137 casualties from a strength of 500, a casualty rate of 27%. The 117th Infantry Regiment suffered 380 casualties from approximately 1,500 engaged, a rate of 25%. Tank destroyer units and attached artillery suffered lighter casualties because their roles kept them more distant from direct infantry combat. The casualty figures were significant but not catastrophic compared to other Bulge battles. Bastogne, for example, suffered over 3,000 American casualties. But Stavelot's casualties brought disproportionate strategic results by stopping the offensive's most dangerous penetration. German casualty figures for Stavelot remain estimates because German records from the period are incomplete and often contradictory. American intelligence officers compiled estimates based on body counts, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents. The estimated German casualties: 600 to 800 killed, 1,200 to 1,500 wounded or captured. Kampfgruppe Piper's equipment losses were precisely documented because the abandoned vehicles at La Glaise were catalogued. 60 tanks and assault guns total loss, plus approximately 150 half-tracks, trucks, and support vehicles destroyed or captured. The equipment represented approximately 50 million Reichsmarks worth of material, an astronomical sum representing months of German production. Personnel losses were severe but replaceable. Equipment losses at this stage of the war were catastrophic and irreplaceable. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't sustain losing 60 tanks in a single operation while simultaneously fighting on eastern and western fronts. Civilian casualties required different accounting methods because Belgian civil authorities rather than military units compiled the records. Dr. Henri Pierson's Belgian Red Cross survey, completed in early January 1945, tallied 131 confirmed civilian deaths, 37 executed by German forces, 62 killed by military action, artillery, small arms, building collapses, 19 killed in accidents or from exposure medical emergencies during the battle, 13 whose cause of death couldn't be determined from remains. The survey noted that some civilian casualties might never be counted because families had fled before the battle and never returned to report missing relatives. The execution victims were documented with particular care because their deaths constituted war crimes requiring investigation. Father Hanlett provided testimony, identifying victims and describing circumstances. Belgian witnesses provided statements about execution, locations, and approximate times. The documentation would later support war crimes charges at the Malmedy trial. The liberation of Stavelot was official but incomplete. American forces controlled the town, but thousands of former residents remained displaced. Some had fled to relatives in other regions of Belgium. Others sheltered in refugee centers established by Allied military government. Returning required finding transportation through a war zone, verifying that one's house still existed, or finding alternative shelter if it didn't, and rebuilding lives from whatever could be salvaged. The Belgian government established an assistance program providing temporary housing, food rations, and reconstruction materials, but resources were limited and demand was overwhelming. Stavelot was one of dozens of Belgian communities requiring assistance. Priority went to towns with strategic importance or larger populations. Stavelot received modest aid and was largely left to rebuild itself through community effort and whatever materials residents could obtain. The accounting process, casualty figures, damage assessments, assistance programs, reduced human catastrophe to bureaucratic data that could be compiled, analyzed, and filed. The accounting was necessary for military analysis, reconstruction planning, and historical record. But accounting could never capture what the battle actually meant to individuals who'd experienced it. The engineer who'd held a foxhole wondering if his defense mattered. The civilian who'd lost her house wondering where she'd live. The widow receiving notification that her husband had been killed in a town she'd never heard of. Defending a bridge whose importance she'd never understand. Wars generate statistics. Statistics generate histories. But underneath statistics and histories exist individual experiences that resist reduction to numbers and narratives. Stavelot was 93 destroyed buildings and 241 American forces, dead and 131 civilian casualties. Stavelot was also 10,000 individual stories of fear and loss and survival that would never be fully told because most veterans and survivors preferred silence to remembering. January 10, 1945. Colonel William Lovelady submitted his after-action report on the Battle of Stavelot to 30th Infantry Division headquarters. The report's conclusion was professional and understated. Stavelot was held against significant enemy pressure. The bridge was secured. Enemy advance was halted, and enemy forces were prevented from reinforcing or withdrawing. Mission accomplished. The report didn't mention that mission accomplishment cost 600 American casualties. It didn't describe the close-quarters fighting in streets or the civilians killed in cellars. It didn't acknowledge that engineers had held when retreat seemed inevitable, or that victory resulted partly from German failures as much as American success. Military reports rarely contain those acknowledgments because their purpose is documenting operations, not interpreting meaning. Lovelady's report became one of thousands compiled during the Bulge, filed in archives, used by historians writing official histories. The report told what happened. It didn't explain what it meant or what it cost beyond numbers that measured everything except what actually mattered. January 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight Eisenhower reviewed after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge and marked certain battles for detailed analysis. Stavelot received a notation in Eisenhower's handwriting. Critical stand, prevented enemy breakthrough to Meuse, recommend commendations. The notation reflected Eisenhower's understanding that wars are won not just by massive operations involving armies, but by small unit actions at critical points. Stavelot was never going to appear in newspaper headlines. Bastogne dominated press coverage because it involved a surrounded American garrison and a dramatic relief operation. But Eisenhower understood that Stavelot mattered strategically in ways Bastogne didn't. Bastogne was symbolically important, but operationally contained. German forces bypassed it and continued west. Stavelot was the choke point that actually stopped the most dangerous German penetration. Stopping Piper at Stavelot changed the offensive's outcome more than holding Bastogne, even though Bastogne received infinitely more publicity. German High Command's post-battle analysis, compiled in February 1945 from surviving records and commander interviews, identified Stavelot as the point where Operation Wacht am Rhein failed. The analysis was remarkably candid about German failures. Piper's decision to halt on the night of December 17th, rather than rushing the bridge in darkness, identified as critical error costing 6 hours that allowed American defenses to organize. The failure to recognize the fuel depot's importance, identified as intelligence failure with strategic consequences. The inability to reopen the Stavelot corridor despite 3 major attacks, identified as evidence that American forces had adapted to German tactics faster than German commanders recognized. The analysis concluded that Stavelot represented the moment when German operational tempo, the speed and shock that had characterized successful operations earlier in the war, proved insufficient against American forces that had learned defensive warfare. The offensive hadn't failed because German soldiers were incompetent. It had failed because American soldiers had become competent enough to stop them. Counterfactual analysis, the what-if questions that historians debate, focuses heavily on Stavelot because the battle's outcome was contingent rather than predetermined. What if Piper had attacked the bridge immediately on the night of December 17th instead of waiting for dawn? American defenses weren't fully organized. Engineers were still positioning weapons. The bridge wasn't wired for demolition. A night attack had substantial risk, but might have succeeded in capturing the bridge before American reinforcements arrived. What if Lieutenant Taylor's bridge demolition charges had detonated on the morning of December 18th? The span would have dropped. Piper's advance would have been stopped completely, and his Kampfgruppe would have been trapped east of Stavelot rather than reaching L'Église. What if Piper had recognized the fuel depot's importance and seized it on December 18th? His Kampfgruppe could have refueled completely and potentially reached the Meuse. These counterfactuals suggest that Stavelot's outcome was determined by small decisions and random chances rather than overwhelming force. The military analysis of Stavelot focuses on comparative force structures and their effectiveness. American defenders at Stavelot initially numbered approximately 500 engineers with minimal anti-tank capability. German attackers numbered approximately 5,000 troops with over 100 tanks. By conventional military analysis, the Americans should have been overrun in hours. Instead, they held for 36 hours before being forced from the town, and even then they retained positions that allowed immediate counterattack when reinforcements arrived. The force ratio, 10-1 in German favor, should have been decisive. It wasn't because several factors offset numerical superiority. American defenders occupied prepared urban terrain that negated armor advantages. German forces were operating at the end of extended supply lines and couldn't sustain prolonged operations, and American reinforcements arrived quickly enough to counterattack before German victory could consolidate. The battle demonstrated that force ratios matter less than situation and timing. Statistical comparisons between Stavelot and other Bulge battles reveal Stavelot's disproportionate strategic importance, despite relatively small scale. Bastogne involved approximately 18,000 American defenders and 35,000 German attackers over 2 weeks. Stavelot involved initially 500 American defenders, growing to roughly 2,000, against German forces that varied from 5,000 to 8,000, depending on the period measured, over 5 days of intense fighting. Bastogne's defense was operationally impressive, but didn't stop German advance. German forces bypassed the town and continued west. Stavelot's defense actually halted the most dangerous German penetration and cut the supply line of the offensive's spearhead. Yet Bastogne received presidential unit citations for multiple units, appeared in dozens of books and films, and remains culturally famous. Stavelot received one presidential unit citation for the 291st Engineers, appears in few popular histories, and remains largely unknown outside military specialist communities. The fuel depot's preservation had direct operational consequences that extended far beyond the Stavelot battle. American counteroffensive operations in January 1945, the attacks that reduced the Bulge salient and pushed German forces back to their starting positions, consumed enormous quantities of fuel. The 3rd Armored Division alone used approximately 40,000 gallons daily during active operations. The Stavelot depot, containing over 2 million gallons after minimal evacuation, directly supplied forward units throughout January. Without that fuel, American counteroffensive operations would have been delayed, while supplies were brought forward from rear areas. The delay might have been days or weeks, depending on weather and transportation availability. Those delays would have allowed German forces additional time to establish defensive positions, increasing casualties required to reduce the salient. The fuel depot's preservation didn't win the war, but it accelerated victory by sustaining operations that might otherwise have stalled for logistical reasons. The broader strategic context suggests that Stavelot's outcome influenced the war's final months, even though those influences are difficult to quantify precisely. Germany's last strategic reserve, the panzer divisions committed to the Bulge, were destroyed or severely damaged in operations that included Stavelot. Those divisions couldn't be reconstituted because German industry couldn't replace the losses. When Soviet forces launched their final offensive in January 1945, German defenses in the east were weaker because reserves had been expended in the west. The connection between Stavelot and Soviet victory seems distant, but strategic reality is that resources are finite. Every Panther destroyed at Stavelot or abandoned at L'Église was one fewer Panther available to defend Berlin. Every SS trooper killed attacking Stavelot's eastern approaches was one fewer defender available when the final battles came. Stavelot contributed to German defeat not through dramatic battlefield victory, but through attrition that Germany couldn't sustain. Military theorists studying Stavelot focus on the battle's lessons about defensive warfare and the importance of critical terrain. The bridge at Stavelot had no intrinsic military value, it was just stone and mortar. But its location at a choke point where German forces needed to cross gave it value that both sides recognized. American defenders understood that losing the bridge meant losing the ability to stop Piper's advance. German attackers understood that capturing the bridge meant opening the route to the Meuse. Both sides committed forces beyond what the bridge's physical characteristics justified, because strategic position mattered more than tactical strength. Modern military doctrine incorporates these lessons. Terrain matters not for itself, but for how it channels operations and creates choke points. Stavelot was a case study in fighting for terrain that matters strategically, even when it appears insignificant tactically. The individual contribution of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion to the war's outcome is difficult to measure, but impossible to dismiss. 500 construction workers held a bridge for 36 hours against an SS panzer column. That shouldn't have been possible. Military theory said it was impossible, but it happened because soldiers who weren't trained for infantry combat fought as infantry anyway, because officers like Major Solis made competent decisions under pressure, because sergeants like Charles Hensel positioned weapons effectively despite inadequate resources. The engineers' stand didn't single-handedly win the war, but it prevented German forces from achieving the breakthrough that might have extended the war. Extended wars cost more casualties. The Engineer Battalion's casualties, 137 men killed or wounded, purchased an outcome that prevented thousands of additional casualties. That's the brutal mathematics of warfare, small units suffering limited casualties to prevent larger disasters. Eisenhower's notation about Stavelot being a critical stand was accurate but understated. Critical stands in warfare are often recognized only in retrospect, after historians analyze what would have happened if the stand had failed. Stavelot's defenders didn't know they were fighting a critical battle. They knew only that they had orders to hold and enemies were attacking. The criticality became apparent only when analysts traced alternative outcomes. If Stavelot falls on December 17th, Piper crosses and continues west. If Piper reaches the fuel depot, he refuels and continues toward the Meuse. If Piper reaches the Meuse, German forces have achieved the offensive's primary objective, and Allied plans for final victory are delayed. None of that happened because 500 engineers held a bridge. The contingency of history, the way small events cascade into large consequences, was perfectly demonstrated at Stavelot, where ordinary soldiers doing their jobs changed the war's outcome in ways they never understood. May 16, 1946. Dachau, Germany. The war crimes trial designated United States versus Valentin Bersin et al., popularly known as the Malmedy trial, opened in a courtroom specially constructed in the former concentration camp. 73 defendants sat in the dock, including SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, charged with the murder of American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians at multiple locations during the Battle of the Bulge. Piper sat in the front row of defendants, his uniform stripped of insignia, his face showing no emotion as prosecutors read the charges. Violation of the laws and customs of war through the murder of 350 American soldiers and 111 Belgian civilians. The specific locations included Malmedy, or more precisely Baunez Crossroads, where 84 Americans had been machine-gunned in a field, plus execution sites at Stavelot, La Neuville, and a dozen other Belgian villages. The trial would last 9 weeks and generate thousands of pages of testimony. Its verdict would execute some defendants, imprison others, and generate controversy that persists 80 years later about whether justice was served or vengeance was disguised as law. The prosecution's case rested primarily on survivor testimony and forensic evidence from massacre sites. Private Homer Ford testified about the Malmedy massacre with detail that made the courtroom silent: how his artillery unit had surrendered without resistance, how German soldiers had herded prisoners into a field, how machine guns had opened fire without warning. Ford described playing dead while German soldiers walked among bodies firing pistol shots into anyone who moved. He described lying in frozen mud for 3 hours before crawling away under cover of darkness. His testimony was corroborated by 42 other Malmedy survivors, whose accounts were consistent in describing deliberate execution rather than combat action. The defense argued that survivor testimony was unreliable because traumatized witnesses couldn't accurately remember events from chaotic combat situations. The prosecution countered with forensic evidence. American investigators had excavated the Malmedy site and recovered 84 bodies, most with bullet wounds to the head, consistent with execution rather than combat. The forensic evidence supported survivor accounts. Stavelot civilian massacres received detailed attention because multiple witnesses could testify about circumstances. Father Louis Hanlett described the December 18th execution of 8 Belgian men, naming victims and describing how SS troops had lined them against a wall and shot them without trial or formal charges. Belgian railway worker Marcel Dubois' widow testified about her husband's execution, stating he'd been accused of signaling American forces, an accusation she insisted was false. Dr. Henri Pearson testified about documenting civilian casualties, presenting photographs of execution sites, and describing bullet wounds consistent with close-range shooting. The defense argued that civilians executed at Stavelot were legitimate targets because they'd engaged in partisan activity. The prosecution countered that even if partisan activity occurred, which wasn't proven, summary execution without trial violated Geneva Convention protections for civilians in occupied territory. The judges sided with prosecution, ruling that executions without trial constituted war crimes, regardless of suspected partisan activity. Joachim Piper's testimony consumed 3 days and revealed a defendant who was intelligent, articulate, and largely unrepentant. Piper acknowledged commanding Kampfgruppe Piper during the offensive. He acknowledged that massacres had occurred within his area of operations. He denied ordering massacres or knowing about them when they occurred. He attributed executions to battlefield confusion, rogue subordinates, and the chaos of mobile warfare where command and control breaks down. Prosecutors challenged Piper's denials by presenting captured German documents showing that Piper's pre-battle briefings had emphasized speed and ruthlessness, telling subordinates that prisoners and civilians shouldn't be allowed to slow the advance. Piper responded that ruthlessness meant tactical aggression, not murder. He claimed that any subordinate who'd interpreted his orders as authorization for atrocities had misunderstood his intent. The prosecutor's response was devastating. Whether Piper directly ordered massacres or created an environment where subordinates believed massacres were acceptable, he bore command, responsibility for crimes committed by his units. The defense strategy emphasized several arguments that generated post-war controversy. First, the defense argued that American interrogation techniques had included physical coercion and psychological pressure to obtain confessions. Several defendants testified about mock executions, solitary confinement, and threats against family members used to extract statements. American investigators acknowledged some aggressive interrogation tactics, but denied torture or coercion that would invalidate confessions. The judges ruled that while some interrogation methods were inappropriate, the confessions were generally reliable because they were corroborated by physical evidence and consistent across multiple defendants. Second, the defense argued that battlefield conditions created fog of war situations, where soldiers couldn't distinguish between legitimate combat actions and war crimes. The judges rejected this argument, ruling that executing surrendered prisoners and unarmed civilians couldn't be justified by battlefield confusion. The distinction between combat and atrocity was clear even in chaotic situations. July 16, 1946. The verdicts were announced in a courtroom packed with press, survivors, and observers. Joachim Piper, guilty on all charges, sentenced to death by hanging. 42 other defendants, guilty, sentenced to death. 22 defendants, guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment. 8 defendants, guilty, sentenced to lesser terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. 0 defendants acquitted. The sentences reflected the tribunal's conclusion that Kampfgruppe Piper had systematically violated the laws of war and that command responsibility extended from Piper through his subordinate officers to soldiers who'd pulled triggers. The death sentences were intended to be carried out within months, establishing precedent that war crimes would be punished severely, but the sentences were never carried out as originally intended because post-war politics complicated justice in ways that frustrated survivors and historians. The controversy over the Malmedy trial centered on interrogation methods and questions about whether defendants had received fair trials. In 1948, the United States Army convened a commission to investigate allegations of improper interrogation techniques. The commission found that some American investigators had used physical force and psychological pressure to obtain confessions from some defendants. The findings generated political controversy in the United States, where some politicians argued that convictions obtained through coercion were invalid regardless of defendants' actual guilt. Senator Joseph McCarthy, beginning his career of controversial investigations, held hearings about the Malmedy trial that questioned whether American investigators had acted appropriately. The hearings were politically motivated but raised legitimate questions about interrogation ethics. The result was that death sentences were reviewed and progressively commuted. By 1950, all 43 death sentences had been reduced to life imprisonment or lesser terms. Joachim Piper was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956 after serving 11 years of his commuted sentence. His release generated outrage among survivors and veterans who believed justice had been subverted. Piper spent his remaining years living quietly in France under an assumed name, working as a translator and avoiding publicity. His presence in France remained secret until the 1970s, when his identity was discovered. In July 1976, Piper was murdered, shot, and his house burned, in what was probably an assassination by individuals who'd tracked him based on his war crimes record. The murder was never solved, though investigations suggested it was politically motivated rather than random violence. Piper's death eliminated any possibility of further legal proceedings or truth-seeking about his role in Bulge atrocities. His life and death embodied unresolved questions about justice, responsibility, and whether war criminals can ever escape their pasts. The Malmedy trial established important legal precedents about command responsibility and the prosecution of war crimes. The trial affirmed that commanders bear responsibility for crimes committed by subordinates even if commanders didn't directly order those crimes. This principle, that creating an environment where atrocities are likely or failing to prevent known atrocities constitutes criminal responsibility, became foundational in subsequent war crimes prosecutions. The trial also demonstrated challenges in prosecuting war crimes. Evidence is often fragmentary, witnesses are traumatized and potentially unreliable, defendants have incentives to minimize their involvement, and political considerations can interfere with justice. These challenges persist in modern war crimes tribunals, and the Malmedy trial is studied as a case study in both the necessity and difficulty of prosecuting atrocities committed during warfare. The broader question raised by the Malmedy trial is whether justice for war crimes is possible or whether trials serve primarily symbolic functions. Survivors who testified at the trial expressed mixed views. Some felt vindicated by convictions and sentences, believing justice had been served. Others felt betrayed when death sentences were commuted and defendants were eventually released. Major Hal McCown, who testified about Piper's treatment of prisoners at La Glaise, expressed the view that the trial had established important historical record, even if punishment proved inadequate. We needed the trial to document what happened. Whether Piper hanged or went to prison mattered less than ensuring the massacres were formally acknowledged as crimes rather than forgotten as unfortunate incidents. The trial created an official record that Holocaust deniers and historical revisionists couldn't easily dismiss. That record mattered even when sentencing outcomes disappointed those seeking maximum punishment. The Malmedy trial's legacy extends beyond its specific verdicts to its influence on how modern militaries train soldiers about the laws of war. The trial demonstrated that following orders isn't a defense for atrocities, that commanders bear responsibility for subordinates' actions, and that battlefield chaos doesn't excuse violations of Geneva Convention protections. Modern military law education uses the Malmedy trial as a case study in what constitutes war crimes and how individual soldiers are expected to refuse illegal orders. The trial's lessons appear in military academies, officer training courses, and enlisted personnel education programs. The hope, likely naive but necessary, is that teaching about Malmedy and similar atrocities will prevent future violations by creating military cultures where soldiers understand their legal obligations and commanders understand their responsibility to prevent crimes. Whether education actually prevents atrocities is debatable, but the Malmedy trial provided clear historical examples of what happens when military discipline and legal constraints fail. December 18, 2024. 80 years after the battle. Stavelot's town square fills with perhaps 300 people, Belgian officials, American veterans and their families, historians, local residents, for the anniversary ceremony commemorating the Battle of Stavelot. The crowd is smaller than it was at the 60th or 70th anniversaries because the last American veterans who fought at Stavelot are dead now, their children are elderly, and public interest in 80-year-old battles competes with contemporary concerns. A Belgian official delivers remarks in French, thanking American forces for liberating the town and acknowledging the cost paid by soldiers and civilians. An American embassy representative reads a prepared statement honoring the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and the 117th Infantry Regiment. A brass band plays the American and Belgian national anthems. The ceremony is dignified and sincere and attended by far fewer people than would come to a similar ceremony at Bastogne, 3 hours drive south, where thousands gather annually because Bastogne is famous while Stavelot remains obscure. The December 1944 museum in Stavelot occupies a restored townhouse on the Rue de l'Église and contains artifacts, photographs, and documents from the battle. The museum opened in 1994, 50 years after the battle, funded by Belgian government grants and private donations. It attracts approximately 12,000 visitors annually, mostly military historians and tourists who have specifically sought out Bulge, battle sites. The museum's collection includes American and German weapons recovered from battle sites, photographs of destroyed Stavelot taken in late December 1944. Testimonies from survivors recorded in the 1980s and 90s, before most witnesses died, and a detailed diorama showing American and German positions during the battle. The museum director, a Belgian historian named François Gillet, notes that visitor numbers have declined over the past decade as the generation with personal connections to the war passes. In 20 years, Gillet says, visitors will come purely from historical interest rather than family connection. The battle will be completely history rather than living memory. Memorial plaques mark specific locations throughout Stavelot where significant events occurred. A bronze plaque on the Rue Haute identifies the site where 8 Belgian men were executed on December 18, 1944. A granite marker at the bridge approach commemorates the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's defense. A stone monument in the town cemeteries lists names of Stavelot residents killed during the battle. The plaques are well maintained and include text in French, English, and German. A conscious choice by Belgian authorities to acknowledge that German soldiers also died at Stavelot, even though their cause was unjust. The multilingual plaques have generated occasional controversy, with some arguing that German soldiers who participated in war crimes shouldn't be memorialized alongside their victims. The Belgian response has been that the plaques acknowledge historical fact that Germans died at Stavelot without endorsing German actions or equating German and Allied causes. Marie-Claire Grégoire, granddaughter of Madame Renée Grégoire, who survived the battle, lives in Brussels now, but returns to Stavelot occasionally for family visits. She never met her grandmother, who died in 1963, before Marie-Claire was born, but she grew up hearing family stories about the battle. My grandmother never spoke about the war until the 1980s, Marie-Claire explains. For 35 years, she said nothing. Then one day she started talking and couldn't stop. She told my mother everything, about hiding in cellars, about finding her house destroyed, about neighbors who were killed. My mother said it was like a dam breaking. Marie-Claire visited the site where her grandmother's house stood, now occupied by a modern building constructed in 1952, and tried to imagine the street as it appeared in 1944. I can't, she admits. The physical landscape has changed completely. The emotional landscape is something I'll never understand because I wasn't there. But I carry the stories. That's what grandchildren do. We carry stories we didn't live through. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion held its final reunion in 1998, and fewer than 30 veterans attended from a unit that had numbered over 1,000 men during the war. The veterans gathered in Stavelot at the invitation of Belgian authorities, received medals from the Belgian government, and toured the town with local officials who explained reconstruction efforts. Sergeant Charles Hensel, who'd positioned the bazooka teams that stopped the 1st Panther, gave an interview to a Belgian television crew. He was asked whether the defense of Stavelot was the proudest moment of his military service. Hensel's response was characteristically modest. "I don't know about proud. We did what we were told to do, hold the bridge, so we held the bridge. Other units did harder things. We just did our job." The interviewer pressed, didn't he realize his unit had changed history by stopping Piper? Hensel shrugged. Maybe, but when you're in a foxhole shooting at tanks, you're not thinking about history. You're thinking about not dying. History is something other people figure out later. The controversy over memorializing Joachim Piper illustrates how memory of the battle remains contested. In Austria, where Piper was buried after his 1976 murder, a memorial headstone was erected by SS veterans organizations. The headstone described Piper as a soldier without mentioning war crimes convictions. In the early 2000s, unknown individuals repeatedly vandalized the headstone, eventually destroying it completely. Austrian authorities declined to allow replacement, stating that public memorials to convicted war criminals were inappropriate. The incident generated debate about whether German soldiers who committed war crimes should be memorialized at all, with some arguing that acknowledging their service was separate from endorsing their crimes, while others argued that war criminals forfeited the right to honorable remembrance. The debate remains unresolved, reflecting broader tensions about how societies remember wars that include both heroism and atrocity. Bastonia's greater fame compared to Stavelot illustrates how public memory of battles is shaped by narratives rather than strategic importance. Bastonia benefited from compelling narrative elements: a surrounded garrison, dramatic air resupply, General Patton's relief column breaking through at the last moment. The story had clear heroes and dramatic tension and a satisfying resolution. Stavelot's narrative was more complex: engineers holding a bridge, infantry counterattacking, German forces escaping, civilian casualties mounting. The story lacked clear dramatic arc and involved more ambiguity about heroism and cost. Bastonia received books, films, miniseries, and permanent place in popular culture. Stavelot received academic histories and specialized military studies. The disparity reflects that public memory favors simple heroic narratives over complex, ambiguous ones. Military historians understand Stavelot's strategic importance exceeded Bastonia's, but public understanding follows different logic. Modern military analysis of Stavelot focuses on lessons about small unit leadership, defensive operations, and the importance of engineer units in combined arms warfare. The United States Army uses Stavelot as a case study in its Command and General Staff College curriculum, examining how Major Solis's decision-making, under pressure, Sergeant Hensel's tactical employment of limited anti-tank weapons, and Lieutenant Taylor's bridge defense efforts contributed to successful defense despite overwhelming German advantages. The lessons emphasize that training and leadership matter more than equipment quantity, that engineers must be trained for combat roles beyond their technical specialties, and that defensive operations require flexibility to respond to rapidly changing situations. Whether these lessons prevent future military failures is questionable. Every war demonstrates that lessons learned from previous wars are imperfectly applied to new circumstances, but Stavelot provides concrete historical examples that make abstract principles tangible. The question of what ordinary people owe to extraordinary moments defines Stavelot's memory and legacy. 500 engineers held a bridge when retreat seemed rational and defense seemed suicidal. They held because orders demanded it and because professional duty required it, and perhaps because some vague sense of significance suggested this particular bridge mattered more than bridges generally. They were correct. The bridge mattered more than they could have known, but their correctness was partly accidental. They didn't know they were stopping the most dangerous German penetration of the offensive. They knew only that they had orders to hold, and that holding required fighting. The distance between what soldiers know in the moment and what history reveals later is vast. Stavelot's defenders fought without understanding their battle's significance. They deserve recognition precisely because significance wasn't their motivation. They fought because fighting was their job. That professionalism changed history. December 2024. The anniversary ceremony concludes with a moment of silence. 300 people stand quietly in Stavelot's reconstructed square, surrounded by buildings that replace those destroyed 80 years earlier, standing on streets that were once littered with shell casings and bodies. The silence lasts 1 minute, inadequate for reflecting on 5 days of battle and 80 years of memory, but sufficient for acknowledging that something important happened here. The crowd disperses slowly, some visitors heading to the museum, others walking toward the bridge to see where the battle's critical moments occurred. A few elderly Belgians remain in the square, talking quietly in French about grandparents who survived the battle and great-grandparents who didn't. The physical town has long since recovered. The memorial landscape, plaques and monuments and museums preserve selective memory of what happened. But the actual experience, the terror and violence and confusion and loss, is irretrievable now, accessible only through documents and testimonies that approximate but never capture what 5 days in December 1944 meant to people who lived through them. The town that held has become the town that mostly forgot, not from disrespect, but from the natural progression of time and memory. Stavelot residents go about daily lives in a town where most weren't alive when the battle occurred. Teenagers walk streets without knowing those streets were once battlefields. Shopkeepers work in buildings constructed on sites where previous buildings were destroyed by artillery. Life continues because life always continues, even in places where history briefly concentrated in catastrophic ways. The monuments remain as reminders, but reminders require people who remember what they're being reminded about. As the last witnesses die and their children age, and grandchildren inherit stories they didn't experience, Stavelot's battle recedes from living memory into pure history, important for understanding the war, but disconnected from present experience. That transition is inevitable and perhaps necessary. Societies can't indefinitely mourn events from generations past. But the transition carries cost, the forgetting of specific human experiences that made the battle real. Numbers and strategies and outcomes survive in histories. Individual moments of fear and courage and suffering disappear into silence that monuments can mark but never breach.